Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome towards this session of exam prep of AZ-104, talking about Microsoft Azure Administrator. So, in this specific session, we are going to discuss about our roadmap that needs to be covered up before going towards the examination of this AZ-104. We're going to discuss about some important topics, accordingly, which we need to prepare ourselves for the examination of this AZ-104. And also, we're going to have a look about some sample questions that will help us to understand which level of questions can be expected at the exam, and also what kind of questions can we expect. Either way, apart from this session of AZ-104, if you guys wanted to join our upcoming sessions as well, that is going to be our exam prep sessions and some free webinars which has been hosted by the GTechLearn itself. So you can actually scan this QR code using your mobile section, and then you can go towards our page of webinars and you can register yourself for the upcoming ones. And apart from that, you can visit our website gtechlearn.com/webinar.axpx for reaching out our the information of our upcoming webinars and to register yourself over there. Talking about the certification journey of AZ-104. So how can we actually start to adhere the journey of this AZ-104? So there are some prerequisites that needs to be understand before going towards this examination of AZ-104. And the prerequisite is you guys must need to have a certification of AZ-900. Not on It's not the mandatory certification, but you need to know about the things that we are covering under the course of AZ-900. So you need to learn about that course first. After learning this course of AZ-900, where you will get the some fundamental knowledge about the cloud infrastructure relatively for the Azure, that how Azure is working, what are the different services provided by the Azure to us, and which services can be utilized at which place. After getting all those informations, you can come up here and start preparing yourself for AZ-104 exam. Over there, you can prepare yourself by using the multiple ways, like you can attend some Microsoft trainings. So how the Microsoft trainings need to be associated. So over there, the Microsoft is providing some self-paced online learning material over to the Microsoft Learn website. You can visit to that website, and from there you can start learning on your own. You will get the topics, you will get the information about the topics, you will get the labs regardingly that topic, and also some knowledge sessions regardingly the same. So you can go there and start learning on your own. The next thing, you can attend some instructor led training for AZ-104. You can also register yourself using the MS Learn portal as well. So in the MS Learn portal, you will find a way to go for registering yourself of an instructor led. You need to go there and register yourself for that class. So over there, an instructor is going to be provided to you, a dedicated one for the next 4 days. Till now, the whole course is going to be discussed over there, and we're going to provide you the better opportunities, the labs, as well as the private instructor to give you the full informations about the topics, and also to help you to clear your doubts and so on. So these are some trainings that can be attended from the Microsoft side. Apart from that, if you'll talk about the certification, so just like the way we discussed about the Azure fundamentals, that means our AZ-900 certification, so it's going to be an optional one. If you guys wanted to go for the certification of AZ-900, then it's going to be good. Otherwise, if you are not certified yourself with the AZ-900, but you do have some knowledge about that course, so you can go there and start registering your exam for AZ-104 as well. Over there, what kind of hands-on experience we required before going towards the exam of this AZ-104? So over there, we required approximately of 6 months of your working with the cloud infrastructure, where you have working towards the implementing area, managing area, and also the monitoring area of your Azure resources, whatever has been deployed in a company. Also, it will require some strong understanding of Azure core services, like what kind of services are offered by the Azure, on what basis, what is going to be the offer model, what is going to be the service model, and also who is providing that services. Is it the same Microsoft is providing the services in the Azure, or maybe it's a third party service that can be utilized in the Azure? So you need to have those understanding on a very clear note. Also, we required some sort of experience interacting with the Azure interfaces like Azure CLI, Azure Portal, as well as your Visual Studio and the other Azure environments, whatever we have from where we can manage the things. Talking about some self-study resources. So if you guys wanted to go for the self-study on your own, so you can go ahead and take on the hands-on labs. So you can go to the GitHub repository, and over to the GitHub repository, there is going to be a folder of AZ-104. You can visit to that folder, and inside that you will find out all the labs steps that needs to be completed for preparing yourself for the exam. Also, you will find the Microsoft Docs relatively for each and every topics that are coming under this AZ-104 environment. Also, it will going to give you some sort of Azure Architecture Center that will going to help you to understand about the Azure architecture, that how it's working and so on. Microsoft is also providing some official practice test kit for the AZ-104. You can go there and start preparing yourself using that practice test. Also over there, some sample questions are going to be visited. You can just go there and learn about those questions. Also, it will give you some focus place in skills identifying during the exam prep session, so you can also attend these kind of sessions from the multiple areas. And also there are some exam prep sessions has been uploaded by the Microsoft itself against their courses, so you can also visit to the MS Learn for attending those courses also. Once you have learned yourself about the topics which has been covered under this AZ-104, then you are going to be ready to go for the examinations after once you have these kind of experience available. So once you are understanding each and everything properly and clear, then we are suggesting go for the examinations. And once you will clear your examination, it will going to give you a certificate and the badge of Microsoft Certified Azure Administrator Associate. So this badge is going to be assigned with you, and you will be able to manage the Azure infrastructure after completing that course, and you can get the jobs accordingly. Talking about the objective domains, that from which kind of domains, how much of cases or the questions can be expected in the exam. So over there, if I'll talk about our first domain, that is relatively for managing the Azure identities and governance. So from this area, you can expect up to 20% of questions from this domain. Apart from this, if we'll talk about our second domain known as implementing and managing the storage section. So from this area, you can expect up to 20% of questions in the exam. Then from another a domain called deploying and managing the Azure compute resources. From this domain, you can expect up to 25% of questions in the exam. Also talking about configuring and managing the virtual networking. From that area, you can expect up to 30% of questions in the exam. And the last domain what we are having in this list, talking about monitoring and backup of the Azure resources. So from this area, you can expect up to 15% of questions on your exam. So these are some specified domains from which you can expect how much of questions, all of them is written here. Moving forward to that, if I'll talk about the exam environment, so inside the examinations, you will going to have 150 minutes overall to complete the whole process of your examinations. Out of those, the 30 minutes has been assigned to you for setting up your environment, like testing your PC, checking your microphone, checking your camera, connecting your webcam, and also initializing your applications that is required for the exam, and also providing yourself some introduction over to the before the examinations, like they are going to ask some sort of 5 or 6 few questions about yourself. You need to provide your answers accordingly, whatever the question it is, and the other things. And also to complete the survey, how you would like to have that environment to be lovable or not, or maybe you need to provide some suggestions to improve that criteria thing and improve that specific environment for examinations and so on. So relatively for those things, they will give you an additional of 30 minutes. But apart from that, you can get 120 minutes for your examinations. That is going to be a correct timing. And out of these 120 minutes, you need to complete approximately 40 to 60 questions over there. And these questions could be any type of sometimes you can get a case study in the examinations. And because it's AZ-104 talking about as your infrastructure side, and you are going to be an administrator after that, so they will going to ask you approximately 2 to 3 different case studies depending upon the organization's environment. And according to their case study, in the case study they will going to provide you the company's current environment. They're going to provide you the information about their business requirement, about their technical requirement, about the changes they need, and also about the running infrastructure what they have. After getting those details, they will going to give you some sort of 4 to 5 questions on each and every case study. On those 4 to 5 questions, you need to just read out the questions and answer accordingly. So this is going to be your first section of examination where you will get the case study in the exam. The second section is going to be known as a choose the correct answer, over to which they will going to provide you the problem in the question, and then they will going to provide you the solution as well. In the solutions, they're going to provide you some steps that needs to be followed to get the solutions. You need to make sure that whatever the problem is written in the question, can it be solved by the solution written in the solution area? If it's true, you need to select the option as true. If it's a false, then you need to select the option as false. So in that sections, they will going to give you a 2 to 3 different questions. And for each and every questions, they will going to give you 2 or 3 different answers for each and every problems. But in this section, there is a problem. Like if you have selected the first questions, first problems, solution is true, and then after moving forward you realize that your previous question, whatever the solution was written, that was not the perfectly right, but the current question which you are actually reading, it's now have the perfect solutions written on it. So accordingly you cannot change your answers in that section. So every time you need to answer that section, please be careful before answering them, because in that section, as the Microsoft will not allow you to make any kind of changes over there. So accordingly you will get 2 to 3 questions, and for each and every questions you will get 2 to 3 different solutions to answer them. Then the third segment of your question of your examination is going to be like for multiple choice questions, where they will going to give you some problems in the questions, and accordingly they are going to provide you some answers, like 4 or 5 different answers. Out of them you need to select how many answers are correct, or maybe what different options are correct one. Sometimes they would ask you to select 2 out of 5, sometimes they ask you to select 3 out of 5, sometimes they will ask you to select 1 out of 4. So it's depend on the kind of a questions and the options which are given. If they are going to ask you to select 2 answers or 3 answers in the same questions, so at the end of the question they will going to give you a bracket, and in the bracket they're going to select how much of question, specific options you need to select in the examination area. So that is the third area of your questions. Apart from this, you can expect a kind of a question in the exam where they will going to ask you about some process that needs to be completed using some specific steps. Like I'll say how to create a user. So for creating a user, we know that we need to open the Azure portal by going towards a URL called portal.azure.com. Then I need to go for Azure Active Directory, then I need to select the user area, then I need to select the new user area, then I need to select the fill up the form of the user detail, and then I need to select the save button to create the user. So this is a specific process of completing the task. So what the Microsoft will do, Microsoft will going to provide you the step-by-step informations on the left hand side. You just need to rearrange them in a correct form of order. Like firstly you what need to do, secondly what's need to do, thirdly what's need to do, and so on. So most probably they're going to give you a questions where the step 1 is missing, maybe step 5 is missing, maybe last step is missing, and accordingly the rest of the steps you need to arrange it on a chronological order. So this kind of questions can be expected. The next type of questions can be expected in the exam is relatively for matching scenario. Like on the left hand side, they will going to provide you some answers, and on the right hand side, they're going to provide you some problem statements. You need to select for which problem statement which answer is right from the left hand area. Sometimes only the single options can be filled in all the areas, all the problems. Maybe sometimes in the different problems there is going to be a different kind of solutions that needs to be selected from the solution area. So these kind of questions can be also expected in the exam. So that is going to be an overview how the exam questions will going to be appear. Apart from this, if I'll talk about the number of points that needs to be covered up in the examination. So your total examination will going to cover 100 points, out of which you need to score approximately of 700 plus score. If you are not scoring 700 plus, in that scenario you will going to be failed. If you are having the number of 699 only out of 1000, that means you are failed. So you need to score 700 or more than 700. Also one more thing, that in the examination, go ahead and provide the answers of each and every questions. Do not leave any of the questions behind. Out After that, if I'll talk about the environment, so in the environment in your side, you will get this kind of environment to be written. On the left hand side, you will find the specific information about how many questions are we having inside this segment, and out of those number of questions, on which question you are currently. So it will going to give you that information. You can also mark down, if you wanted to review a question later on after the examination and so on, you can go ahead and mark it as a review later, and then you can review it later on all as well. So it will going to give you a proper notification that you have some questions in the review segment. Also, on the right hand side top, you will find the time remaining option, where it is going to give you the information how much of time is it still remaining to complete that exam and answer the things. So that is how the exam environment will going to be look like. Now let's move ahead and start this specific exam prep sessions about AZ-104. So we're going to discuss each and everything by the domain wise, like what topics are needs to be covered before going towards the examination of AZ-104 here. Before starting that, let's just have a quick introduction in here. So let me start introducing myself. So my name is Shivam Shukla. I'm currently working with the GTechLearn Private Limited. I'm a Microsoft certified trainer and working as a solution architect with GTech. From last 5 years, I'm being MCT and providing the trainings to the multiple industries over there. If I'll talk about my experience in the IT industry, so I have 10 plus years of experience in the IT industry. Initially, I started my career as a business analyst, over to which I was working on towards a technology of Microsoft Excel past 10. Slowly and gradually, I upgraded myself and learned about the different domains of the Microsoft here. So right now I'm able to provide the training in the multiple domains of the Microsoft, like project servers, SharePoint area, Microsoft Power Platform, Microsoft Dynamics environment, Microsoft Azure environment, Microsoft security domains, and lots of other one. If I'll talk about my certification, so I'm having 20 plus certifications in the Microsoft here, out of which some of the certification we are having from the Azure domain, some of them we are having it from the security domain, some of them which are having from the Power Platform domain, and so on. So this is a brief introduction about myself in here. Now let's start discussing about the topics that needs to be covered or needs to be understand. So let's move ahead with our first objective domain in here inside this course, talking about managing the Azure identities and governance. So inside this domain, we're going to discuss about three different types of concept. The very first is managing the Azure Active Directory objects. Second one is managing the access control. And the third one is managing the Azure subscriptions and governance. So moving forward to that, if I'll talk about the first topic we are having in the Azure is Azure Active Directory. We can also call it as a AAD. That is going to be the full form of Azure Active Directory here. So what is this Azure Active Directory? So I would say Azure Active Directory is a kind of a identity solution on a cloud based provided by the Microsoft to us, and it can be accessed via Azure portal. You can also install the Azure AD application itself if you wanted to use it on a third-party solution basis. Microsoft is providing the solutions for that. You can opt for the applications and accordingly you can use them. But the better solution is you need to utilize it in the cloud. So it's going to be a better way to utilize the things. It will going to provide you a central location for managing each and every services, each and every applications, identities, and accessibilities from a central locations. You just need to connect all those services with your Azure AD, and then from the single place, you will be able to manage each and everything. You do not have to open a different identity solutions at a different place to access a different kind of applications here. Azure AD is going to support all of them, whether it's your on-premises applications you guys are working with, either you guys are working with the cloud hosted applications, either you guys are working with the local Active Directory in the Windows server in the on-premises, or maybe you guys are working as a software as a solution spaces like Office 365 or maybe the other tools. And also if you're working on to the HR apps or the finance apps like Salesforce and so on. So Azure Active Directory will be able to provide the centralized solutions for all of them. Not only for these kind of things, but also to manage your different cloud environments. Like if you guys are working with the AWS, with the GCP, so whatever the resources you guys are having over there, you can also connect those resources with your Azure Active Directory and will start managing it from there. So this is also a powerful capability of the Azure Active Directory we are having. It can easily be synchronized with your existing on-premises environment, like whatever the on-premises local Active Directory we are having, we can directly synchronize it towards my Azure Active Directory and then manage the things from the cloud environment from anywhere in the place. The tool which we required to connect both the services is going to be known as AD Connect. So we can start installing the Azure AD Connect tool in my on-premises server, and then using that tool, we can connect both the Active Directories with each other, whether it's my local one, whether it's my cloud-based Azure Active Directory. Talking about the additional capabilities we are having in the Azure Active Directory. So Azure Active Directory has some additional capabilities available in comparison of the on-premises Active Directory. Like the first thing we are having in the additional basis is single sign-on. So for initializing the SSO option, you do not require to install any kind of additional server or additional infrastructure to start using this service. This is going to be a pre-built capability of your Azure AD. The second thing is that they will also provide you the option to manage your user identity as well as the device identity. Also, they will allow you to work with the MFA section. They will allow you to implement the conditional access policy and some identity protection option as well. So Azure AD will going to provide you a multiple types of services and multiple types of features that is currently enabled as a pre-built options. So for them, for using them, you do not require any kind of additional things need to be installed in your area. Moving forward to that, if I'll talk about the licenses in the Azure AD, that what kind of licenses are going to be available. So there are going to be two different types of license. The very first is we can opt for Azure AD enterprise license, and also we can work for Azure AD premium license. So in the Azure AD premium, we're going to have two different licenses. The very first is P1 and the second one is P2. So you can opt for any of the licenses depending upon your own needs. There are going to be a different features that is going to be available with you for working with these different licenses here. In the license management concept, you can actually go and have a look about your current license plan in your organization and also about the details of them and what kind of details we can actually go and check. So we can check how many total number of licenses we are having, how many assigned licenses we are having towards the user, how many available licenses we are having that can be assigned to the upcoming users, and also how many licenses are going to be expired at which time. So each and every information can be checked from the Azure Active Directory. Also, you can easily go and assign the licenses towards the user or towards the group. So if you wanted to associate a kind of a license towards a single user, so from the user property, you can associate him a license on your individual node. If you wanted to assign a bulk license to the group of user or to a teams of user that is going to be work with the same kind of environment or same kind of services, so in that scenario you can create a group, and over to the group you can associate a license. So whenever a person is going to be a part of that group, that person will be able to access that permissions coming under from that license called the group license which you have assigned. Once the user will leave the specific group, the license is automatically going to be removed from his account. But in the individual note, we need to do it on an individual basis every time. So every time we are assigning a license, we need to do it manually. Every time the user didn't require a license, we need to remove it manually as well. One more thing, we can also go ahead and remove and modify the license plan every time. Let's suppose that we are working with the Azure AD enterprise license only, but now my company wants to utilize some additional features provided by the Azure cloud. So I do wanted to increase my license capacity and wanted to modify my features over there. So each and every time at any given point of contact, you can just modify your licenses depending upon your own selections, your own requirement, and also you can remove them. But when it comes that if you wanted to remove the license from those users who are actually getting the licenses using the groups policy or maybe the group licensing options, so over there you need to remove the license from the group always. Then after, the inherited user can have the license to be removed from their account. So this is something which you need to take care every time you are removing the licenses from the user side. Moving forward to that, if I'll talk about the third concept in this list, so we are having the Azure AD administrative unit in the line. That is going to be an important concept in here. So whenever we are saying that we are working with a very large organization, and for each and every large organizations, I'm saying that I'm working in a different geographic location. Like I'm working in India, I'm working in US, I'm working with the Europe, I'm working with the London, I'm working with some Australia and other countries as well. So what we need to understand here, if we are saying that we are associating a kind of a role towards a user, let's suppose I have associated a user administrator role towards one of my employee in the organization. So after getting that license of user administrator, the person is going to have the full authorization to remove, to add, or to modify the changes of any user into the whole organization. That means whatever the user is belongs to his own territory, or maybe his belongs to another territory. Let's suppose one of the user I'm having from India called Ayush, and towards the Ayush account, I have associated the user administrator license. So what the Ayush can do, Ayush can change the properties of its own user who is working under his organization in the India, and also user Ayush going to have a capability to change the property of the users which is currently working in US as well as in Europe as well as in Australia. So the Ayush can make the change of the properties for any of the users. So in that scenario, if I'll say that you wanted to achieve a goal where you are saying that if I'm having the multiple companies and located in the different regions, I wanted to be a person, or maybe I wanted to create a kind of a segment that will help me to provide the specific licenses to those persons, and the person can only manage their own territory. Let's suppose that just like for the Ayush, I'll say that I want Ayush to only utilize that license under the India location. That means how many users are having the India location associated with their account. For them, the Ayush can manage the user property. Other than that, if the person is having the location to be changed from India to US or to the UK, in that situation, Ayush will not be able to modify their properties. So for achieving that particular goal, what we can do is we can create some Azure AD administrative units, and then we can create the units based on the geographical location, based on the branch offices, based on the head offices, and so on. So depending upon your own architecture, you can create the administrative units. After creating the administrative unit, you can associate the person as the owner of that unit to whom you wanted to associate the permission or the specific role, or maybe the specific license. So after that, you need to add the respective members of that administrative unit team, and then whoever the owner of that administrative units will be able to manage the persons or the members of its own administrative units itself. In that scenario, we need to create the AD unit. Then from inside the AD unit, I need to associate a role to the user to whom I am saying that he can manage the things, and then the user can only manage the things relatively for this his own AD, not for the whole organization. So this is a big difference between the role association using the AD or using the Azure Active Directory. Moving forward to that, if I'll talk about the Azure AD roles. So inside the Azure environment, we are going to have two different types of roles that are present. The very first is Azure Active Directory roles, which we can also call it as a Azure AD roles in short. The second type of role is Azure RBAC role, role-based access control. So in the short form, we are calling it as a RBAC role. So the difference between them is Azure AD roles can be utilized to manage your Azure Active Directory concepts or Azure Active Directory works. Azure RBAC role will going to help you to manage the permissions and accessibility of your resources what we are deploying. Like we are deploying the VM, we are deploying the storage account, containers, Kubernetes, and so on. So for managing them, you need to have a RBAC role, but for managing the Active Directory, you need to have the Azure AD roles. So we can call it as a Azure Active Directory role that will help me to manage the things in the directory tenant. The RBAC role will going to help me to manage the things over to the resources. So if I'll talk about the Azure AD rules on an example basis, so there are going to be some examples. The very first is a global administrator, second one is a user administrator, third one is the billing administrator. So Azure AD roles can be applicable particularly to a single user. And once we have associated the user a specific role without using the administrative unit, in that situation, the person is going to have the full authorization to make any kind of changes over to his own directory in the whole organization. Talking about these example roles here, so the global administrator will going to have a most powerful rights in your whole account. The global administrator can manage each and every aspects of your directory tenant. User administrator can only manage the user responsibilities on your Active Directory tenant, and the billing administrator will only be able to manage the billing area of your Active Directory. So that is going to be a main difference. So whenever we are saying that if we are creating a new account, so by default on that new account, you guys are going to have a global administrative rights available. So it's a most powerful rights, and that's why we are recommending that do not provide the global administrative rights to any of the either person who is not required to have that kind of role. And also we were suggesting that if you guys are creating the new account on the Azure, and at that time you are creating the multiple sets of users and you're working as a large organization, so be prepared to create 2 or 3 global administrator account only. And apart from that, you need to create a break free glass account also in terms of the recoverable things. Like if your global administrator will going to leave your company, so in that situation, the break glass free account should be available to manage the other aspects over there. Moving forward to that, if I'll talk about the guest account concepts. So in the Active Directory tenant, in this Azure Active Directory, we can create 2 types of users. The very first is a directory users using the new button. The second one is we can invite the users from the different domains. So whenever we are inviting the users from the different domains and they are going to accept my invitation to work in my organization depending upon our need, so in that situations, we are calling them as a guest account. So account is going to be created in the Active Directory tenant, but it's going to show them as a guest account. So for inviting a specific guest account, you need to go to the users sections in the Azure Active Directory. And then from there, you can click on the new button and then you can click on the invite user button. And from the invite user, once you will select this option, it will going to ask you the email ID of that user, whom do you want it to invite, also the name, also the contact number, and the other details. So you need to fill up the required details and then you can send the invitation to that person. Once the person will got the invitation, he will going to get the link in the email with the invite email. He just need to click on that link to get a specific account to be created in my own Active Directory. So that is how the invite user option can be work. Apart from that, if I'll talk about the user management concept, so here we're going to have a different options available. Like from this Azure AD dashboard, you can go and select the all user options. And from that all user options, you will find these options here to create and manage all the users. The very first option is going to be known as a new user. That means to create a new directory user. If you wanted to invite a user, you need to select the new guest user option. If you wanted to perform the things on a bulk operation, like you wanted to create a multiple users at the same time, like 100, 200 or 10,000 users at the same time. So in that situation, you can work with the bulk operations. Same way, if I'll talk about that, once we have created the specific users in the list and I wanted to go for working with the bulk operation. So in that scenario, once you will click on the bulk operation, it is going to give you an option to download the CSV file. And from the CSV file, you need to fill up the required details and then your account will be going to be created successfully. And from the same area, if you are selecting the respective set of user, so after getting the selection of that user, it will going to allow you to make the password reset of that user. It will allow you to make that user as a restrictive one, to add a license over there, to also see the sign-in logs of that user, audit logs. And also from the all user segment, you can utilize this option here called per user MFA. So from this option, you can also enable the MFA settings for each and every user to whoever whom you wanted to associate this MFA thing. Moving forward to that, if I'll talk about the bulk option, so once you will click on this bulk option in area, then on the right hand side, it will going to open you a pop-up. In the step one, it's going to ask you to download the CSV file. You just need to download the respective CSV file, and inside the CSV file for the user creation, it is going to ask you to update some basic information like the first name of the user, last name of the user, display name of the user, email, the UPN address that it's going to be utilized by the user, and also their password, and then their sign in options availability, and also do you wanted to make that account log out or not. So these basic options you need to fill up. After filling up those details, you can upload the same CSV file in the step number third, and then the whole account will going to be created depending upon how many informations we have provided inside that file. So this is how you can actually perform this bulk user operations. The requirement for working with the bulk user administrator is you need to have a specific role to be associated on your account. Like you need to have a global administrator on your account or maybe the user administrator. So only these two roles can achieve this specific goals to create a bulk user or to create a single user as well. If you guys are not having the user administrator or global administrator role, then you will not be able to create a new user in your directory area. Moving forward to that, if I'll talk about a next kind of role that is known as the RBAC role in the list. So what is this RBAC role? So we are calling it as a role-based access control. It will basically going to be utilized for getting the control over to the resources what we have deployed. Resources could be anything like my virtual machine, virtual network, storage services, container services, stream analytics jobs, logic apps, or maybe the other kind of services which we have installed or the resources which we have created. What it's going to help us, it will going to help us to create some role definitions where I can define what kind of role definition I wanted to provide. Am I providing the owner permission to this resource towards a user? Am I providing the contributor permission? Am I providing the reader permission? Am I providing the specific kind of a other type of permissions like virtual machine contributor, virtual machine disk contributor, or maybe the disk associator, or maybe the disk reader, or same way. So we can have the different kind of roles associated. Accordingly, we can select the role definition here. So the role definition is totally going to be different from your Azure AD roles. So whatever the Azure AD roles are presents, all those rules are not going to be available in this RBAC area, and whatever the rules we are having in the RBAC will not going to be available in the Azure AD roles in a vice versa note. So over there, you need to select the specific role, and then you need to select a scope. Like if I'm saying that I'm associating the contributor role towards one of my user in my Active Directory, so I need to select for which specific resource am I assigning this contributor role to the person. Am I assigning it for my VM only, for a single virtual machine, or for a group of virtual machine, or for a specific subscription, that how many resources are coming under the subscriptions, for all of them he can manage the things, or maybe it is relatively for your specific option like kind of management groups and so on. So you can decide the scope on your side. You can select it via management group basis, via subscription basis, via resource group basis, and via a specific set of resources. So you can select the level of boundary, and accordingly the person will going to have the accessibility of that resources depending upon the scope selected and the role definition selected. Moving forward to that, if I'll talk about some built-in administrative roles we are having on our RBAC section. So we are having the owner role. Owner will going to have the full access to all the resource and can delegate the access to others. That means the owner can have the access of the resources on its own, and also he can share the access to the other persons. However, the contributor will going to have the full access over to the resource, but contributor cannot associate any kind of role to any other users in the list. Also, next one we are having as a reader permission. So over there we can get the specific role of a reader. The person can read the things relatively for that resource, but cannot access the resource and cannot open the resource or edit the resource. Then after we are having the user access administrator. That means the person is going to have the specific access to that specific resource, but cannot make any kind of change over there. So these are some built-in roles. Sorry for that. Am I audible now? Please confirm. Okay, thanks for the confirmation, guys. Okay, so moving forward to that, we were saying that if you guys ever wanted to associate a role towards any of the user, you just need to visit here to this blade called IAM blade of your resource area. And from that area, you need to select the add button. After selecting the add button, you need to go to the role assignment page. Then from the role assignment page, you need to select the add role assignment area. And then you need to select what kind of role am I associating. Am I associating the owner role, or maybe it's a contributor role, maybe it's a reader role, or maybe the other than that. Based on that, you need to select, is it role going to be effective from current time, that means from now, or maybe I wanted to apply this role at after some time in the future. So you can select the date and time accordingly, whether it's going to be applicable from now onwards or maybe from the later on section, and also for how much of time are you assigning this role. By default, the role is going to be associated with the resources for 6 months. You can also extend the date accordingly your requirement. And once you have associated this, the user will going to have the access of that resource depending upon the role they have assigned. Talking about the Azure governance, so inside the Azure, Microsoft is providing the three different options to govern all the resources. The very first is a resource group. Resource group is going to be known as a logical container that will help me to gather all my resources at the same place. So every time I do wanted to find out any of the resources, we do not have to visit to the multiple services area. We can directly open the resource group, and from the resource group, we can find the respective resource which we have created. So this is the first options we can utilize. The second option we are having is a management group. So management group is also going to be known as a logical container, but the management group will going to have the power to gather the resource, also to gather the resource group in itself, and also to gather the subscriptions in it. Like inside the management group, we can have the multiple subscriptions, we can have the multiple resource group, and also we can have the multiple resources. But in the resource group, we can only have a multiple resources included in it. Same way, inside the subscription, we can have the multiple subscriptions, we can have the multiple resources, we can have the multiple resource group, but we cannot gather the management group inside it. But in the management group, we can manage the subscriptions also. Like inside a single group, we can say that we are having a two different subscriptions, which is going to be work on a different hierarchical basis. So we can gather the things and create the management groups up to 7 level of hierarchies. That is going to be the highest one. Talking about the resource group, so just like we discussed, it is a logical container to help us to gather all the resources with at the same place, at the same area. And also one more thing, resource group can't be nested. Like if I want to create a resource group inside the resource group, so it is not going to be a possible thing. We can have a single resource group. Under that, we can only associate the resources here. Talking about the resource lock option, so it is also a very good option in the Azure that will help me to prevent the accidental deletion from the Azure portal. Like I'm saying that we are created some sort of resources like VM containers, storage account, SQL servers, and so on. I am saying that I wanted to create a rule for my SQL server that the SQL server and the storage services cannot be deleted by any one of my environment. So over there, for preventing the deletion of the resource, we can visit to the resource area, open the resource. After opening the resource, we can find out a lock option under the management section, and this lock option is known as the resource lock. So from the lock option, we can define what kind of lock am I wanted to implement in this resource. Is it going to be a lock for deletion of my services? Is it going to be a lock for making my services as a read only? So these two options are available. You can select any of the options from both the list. I would say that because I do not want my users to delete these resources, so I am applying the delete type of lock here. So over there, user can access the resource, can edit the changes, but cannot delete the resource. If you are working with the read only concept, over there, user can access the resource, can view the details, but cannot modify it and cannot delete it. So this is going to be an option coming under the read only section. So you can select any of the options depending upon your situation and also your needs. The next option we are having in line is talking about resource tag. So what is this resource tag? So resource tag is also going to be a kind of a way to generate a kind of a, I'll say the metadata over to my resources. So based on it, we can identify what resources is associated with my which department. And using that metadata, we can actually calculate our billings. Let's suppose in my organization, we have a concept like whatever the resources are being used in the cloud, the payment for those resources needs to be deducted from their uh, I'll say that from their department expenses, whatever their department expenses are, like the as HR department we are having the sales department, marketing department. So whatever their resources are present in the Azure and whatever they are going to utilize them, accordingly, they need to pay the resource amount on them. So without using the resource tag, it is not going to be a possible one that we can categorize the billing using those concepts. So if you wanted to get the billing to be categorized in those manners, we can work with the resource tag, and the resource tag can help me in two ways. The very first is billing. It will help me in the billing. The second way is will help me in the governance. Like we can easily see this specific VM is associate for which specific purpose, for which work, for which department, for which user, and so on. So we can implement a multiple tags also, like one tag is for department, one tag is for work, one tag is for project, one tag is for team, and one tag is for a specific person if it's associated for a specific person only. So accordingly, we can understand that this machine is utilized by this person and the payment needs to be deducted from this department. So this is how we can utilize this option here. Moving forward to that, we are having a next option in line talking about Azure policy. So what is the Azure policy? So Azure policy is going to be a kind of a governance way to work with the kind of a limitations in your account. Like I'm saying, in my organization, only my administrator can deploy a new resource. Other than that, whatever my users are, they cannot deploy the resources. However, they are having the permissions. So what I can do is I can go for creating a policy. Over to the policy, I just need to select the respective users in a group, and then we can select that this group cannot create a resource. This is going to be a kind of a policy we can implement. This is a simple example. If I'm talking about an example, like if I'm allowing the persons who can create the VMs on their own for their respective department, but I am saying I wanted to limit the uses of the CPUs they can opt. Like inside a single virtual machine, they can only work with the two CPUs. They cannot opt for more than two virtual CPUs at the same resource. So for limiting that thing, we can create a Azure policy. In the Azure policy, we can associate a kind of a definition that whenever a user in my environment, in my subscription, wants to create a resource, I wanted to limit the quota to the two virtual CPUs in a compute section. So accordingly, we can create the things. Same way, we can also implement a policy where I can state that inside a single resource group called A, I do not want any of the additional user to implement any of the services here. So I can define a policy over to my A resource group, and I can say that none of the resources can be deployed over there. So this is how the policies thing will can work. So over there, we can enforce the tagging using the policy. We can actually go for applying the naming conversation. We can restrict the resource creation. And also this is going to be an example, like once we have created the Azure policy, how the Azure policy will going to be look like. In the Azure portal, there is an option to create the policy on your graphical view. You can just select the options and accordingly you can create the policy. But in the backend, it will going to be applied in a JSON format. So over there, just like in this image, it is saying that mode is going to be indexed, where I would say the fields in the contact tags parameter tag name exist is going to be false, then effect deny. That means if I'm creating a specific resource in my environment, and over to that, if I'm denying this specific tag name is not filling my that tag name, then the resource cannot be deployed. Once I'm going to associate a tag in the resource while creating, only then the resource can be created. So same way, we have also provided the specific error that if user is not following the specific option, like they are not providing the tagging name and they are just clicking on the create button to create a resource. So over there, we need to give a specific statement that tag name is missing, name of the tag like such an environment and so on. So the name of the tag is missing. You can just provide the tag name and then you can proceed with the creation of the resources. So it will also going to help me in multiple ways, like in the billings, in the governance and so on. So we can implement these kind of policies also. You can also specify a kind of a tag that needs to be associated. Like you need to say that I wanted to get the tag name to be associated in my resources for my company name, as well as my department, as well as my project. So I wanted to apply the specific policy that will allow the user, that will ask the user to put up all these values in there. So in the policy, we can define those kind of tags, that these tags needs to be filled in the resource while creating. So accordingly, the things will going to be worked. Talking about the management group, so just like the thing we discussed, we can create the management groups up to 7 level of hierarchies, under which first one is going to be known as the root management groups. That is going to be a first one in your whole tenant. In each and every tenant, there is going to be a root management option is going to be available. Under the root management groups, we can create the management groups. Also, we can have the subscriptions in it. Under a second level of management groups, we can say we can also create another management groups, and also we can associate our subscriptions in it. So this is how a specific hierarchies can be look like. Over to that, I am saying you, apart from this, under the subscriptions, I'm assigning a specific resource group called A. So that can also be a possible thing in here. So this is how the management groups things will going to be work. And accordingly, we can create a full hierarchy of my environment. Moving forward to that, if I'll talk about, so once we have associated the tags and all those things, so in the billings, in the subscription area, we can manage multiple aspects. We are having a tool in the Azure known as cost management. So the cost management tool will help me to create some cost management based on the resources, based on the department, based on the monthly expenses, based on limiting something relatively for a kind of a resource to be created or to be utilized or to be transacts and so on. So we can manage all those things in there. We can create our whole budget. Like if I'm saying I'm using a subscription A, I am saying in the subscriptions A, I'm only having a permission to access the resource till the billing is $5,000. After $5,000, I do wanted to discontinue the process to access the resources because I do not want to pay more than that. So we can create a budget. We can say in the each whole environment, like from starting of the month till the end of the month, if my expenses is going to be greater than $5,000, I would say stop my services. So we can create the budgets, and also we can create some alerts. Like if my limit is 5,000, I would say I do want it to receive an alert notification whenever my expense is going beyond $4,000. So we can create the alerts for it. So accordingly, we can see the things inside the cost management. Microsoft is also giving you some sort of recommendation that will help you to decrease your cost. Like if you are having some resources in your environment that are not going to be utilized by your company, so what the Microsoft will do, Microsoft will going to find out those resources which you haven't utilized in the last 90 days, or maybe you have utilized in a very low manner. So accordingly, it will going to give you a recommendation that, hey, this specific resource has been created and from last 90 days, you haven't utilized this resource. So if you do not want to utilize this resource, you can discontinue the resource to save your specific amount in your billing. So accordingly, you can visit the recommendations and you can get the recommendations and you can actually save your costing. So that is something we are having in the very first section in this domain of AZ-104. If you guys have any kind of queries relatively for this first domain, you can go ahead and ask your questions in the chat. Okay, so based on the segment we have discussed, we have two questions here to be discussed at the same time, depending upon to check what kind of questions can be expected from there. So I would request all of you to kindly answer the questions in the chat box. So the very first question we are having in line is talking about if you try to deploy a VM and received an error, and the error is code is equal to operations not allowed, and message is operation results in exceeding the quota limits of your core. So which of the following permissions following the principle of least privilege would enable you to fix the error? You need to fix the error from a domain called Microsoft.support area. You need to fix it using the Microsoft.consumption. You need to fix it using the Microsoft.support/read, or you need to fix it from a domain called Microsoft.compute. So let's get your answers on the chat and let me start a timer now. Okay, I got only one answer in the chat. I would request all the other persons to also participate in answering the questions. So the specific option, the correct answer is option A. We need to go for raising the thing from the support area. So we need to raise the support thing under the compute section. We need to raise a support ticket first. So that is going to be our first domain to visit. The next question we are having in line is talking about which of the following actions are allowed by the rule displayed above. So you can see this image, which I'm displaying in the screen. And based on that, you can select which of the rule it is allowed by this specific rules. Option 1, open a support ticket. Option B, get the month's invoice. Option C, check the status of a VM. Or option D, read the activity log. So let's get your answers on the chat and let me start a timer now. Okay, so the correct answer is option B, right? You can get the month's invoice using this specific role called billing reader. Okay, so that is something we were having in the very first segment of this AZ-104. Now let's move ahead and talk about our next segment where we are going to discuss about implementing and managing the storage here. So under this specific segment, we're going to discuss three different concepts. Very first is configuring the access to Azure. Second one is managing the data into the Azure storage account. And the third one is configure the Azure files and Azure blob storage. So the very first thing talking about Azure storage overview. So what is a Azure storage? So Azure storage is going to be a kind of a platform as a service provided by the Microsoft to us to store the data in the cloud, any kind of data. Is it your structured data? Is it your unstructured data? Is it your binary large object data, or maybe your virtual hard disk, or something like that, like the files folder, anything. You can actually upload any kind of data over to the storage services, and it is going to be available on a cloud basis. So it will allow you to store your virtual machines data, where you can go and upload your disk, like the virtual hard disk you guys are using with the machines, your file shares you guys have created, how long you can also define how the data is going to be classified, which of the data is important, which of the data is not important. So you can also maintain those informations here. You can get yourself unstructured data to be uploaded, like the blobs object, like the pictures, images, videos, and so on. And also you can import some sort of a structured data like your tables, Cosmos DB data, SQL servers data, Azure Cosmos DB data, and so on. So these kind of data can be stored in this storage services. Under the storage services, what kind of different options are available? So the very first is Azure Container. So the Azure container will allow me to store any kind of data here, whether it's my structured, non-structured, semi-structured, doesn't matter. If you have any kind of data, you can directly visit to the container and upload the thing over there. However, it is a structured data, doesn't matter. The next thing is Azure files. So Azure files will going to help you to create a kind of a file server on the cloud. Just like we are having a file server in the on-premises that will help my internal employees to work with the shared drive relatively for the file sharing and so on. Accordingly, we can create the same kind of file server inside my cloud, inside the storage account using this Azure files, and then we can connect this Azure file service as a directory. Whatever the folder we are creating here, all the folders can be connected towards the directory on the specific machines, and accordingly the user can access the shared drive directly from the systems. Next one is Azure Tables. Azure Tables is going to be a kind of a area where we can store a kind of a structured or semi-structured data, like a kind of a NoSQL data, like the relationship types of data. Doesn't matter, is it a fully structured, but if it's a kind of a relational data, still we can store it in the Azure Tables. So it's basically going to be work over to the NoSQL concept. The next one is Azure Queue. Azure Queue service is going to be utilized only then when you wanted to work with the messaging services. Like you wanted to store a message in the Azure storage and then want to divert it to your applications. And then whatever the response you are sending towards the application, you wanted to send it back to the customer. So in that scenario, in the middleman, you can work with the Azure Queue services. So Azure Queue services will do one thing, we're going to take the message from the customer, and then depending upon the message which has been come earlier, accordingly it is going to be diverted towards your apps, and based on that you can get the message to be stored on a cloud, and also to be able to read out each and every message on a chronological order, and accordingly you can reply for all of them. Talking about accessing the storage, so whenever I'm saying that you guys have created some sort of containers and stored some sort of blobs over there, and also you guys have created some sort of Azure files, queues, and tables, and you wanted to access them. So the very basic URL can be utilized to access them if you are having a public access enabled. And what kind of access URLs are going to be look like? So here are some examples written for each kind of data that can be accessed. The very first is if you are accessing the container services, then you need to just use a URL here called http slash my storage account. So whatever your storage account name is, let's suppose on my side, I'm saying it's my ST101, it's my storage account. So what I need to specify is https slash st101.blob.co.windows.net. It's going to be my URL for accessing my blob containers of my storage services from the public internet. Same way for the table services, it will just going to change one step over there. Instead of blob, you need to go and work with the table. Same way for the queue service, it will going to change to the queue, and for the file service, it will going to change to the file. So this is a specific URL. Every time you will generate a sharing URL, it's always going to be start in this way. After completing this URL, let's suppose I'm accessing one of my container called container01. So after getting this URL completed in the container services, so after that we need to specify a option, and then we need to select the specific container number which I wanted to access. Is it my number? Is it my name? So whatever the name I have defined for the container, I can specify, and based on that, I can access that container from my public URL. And whatever the blobs are going to be present, it will going to be shown over there. But for that, you need to enable the public access first of all. Next thing is talking about the table services. So same way, you just need to use a slash and then provide a table name. Same way for the file servers and so on. Moving forward to that, if I'll talk about another secure way to access the services, because if I'll say that we are using the public internet to access my data, so how the data is going to be secured? How will we sure that the data is secured? So what we can do is we can actually go for creating a SaaS token where I can store my data on a secured node, that means on an anonymous basis. And based on that, we can generate the SAS token and provide the specific SAS token to the respective person whom we want to access the data. Like I am saying, in my company, I have 5 employees who just I want them only to access my blog which I'm uploading. Other than those 5 persons, I don't want any of the other persons to access my data. So what I can do is I can go for creating the SAS tokens over there. And also we can specify something like if I'm saying that those 5 users can only access my this blob using their Windows PC, which is currently present in the organization network. Apart from that PC, they cannot access the specific blobs from any other places. So in that scenario, while creating the SAS token in the allowed IP address range, we need to specify their IP addresses. So you can specify the IP addresses one by one, or you can specify the whole range of the IP address depending upon the needs. In this area, you need to select a start date and start time, from which date and time the person will be able to start accessing your blob against which you are creating this SAS token. Also, what is going to be the expiry date? So you can limit the expiry also, that after each and every week, the SAS token needs to be expired to work with. And also I'm specifying a single IP address over there, and we can also specify the protocol under which protocol the user can access the things. So I can select the HTTP protocol or the HTTPS protocol. Accordingly, the tokens can be shared and the person can access my data using that token, but it will not be able to access my data using the public URL, because over there we have denied the public access. The next thing we are having in the list is talking about a stored access policy. So whenever I am saying that we do wanted to create a kind of a policy relatively for accessing my storage account, like I'm saying, I wanted to allow the accessibility of my storage account using the storage account key only when the access needs to be get from my one of the web application. Apart from the web application, if the person is trying to access my storage account using the virtual machines or any other area, in that scenario, I wanted to deny them access. So in that scenario, we can create some stored access policy, and using the access policy, we can define from which specific service or which specific location the customer can access my data, and also on what basis, whether they can access my data only on the read only basis, whether they can work on a write basis, whether they can work on a read basis or view basis, or maybe listing, or maybe the different permissions. So you can also specify the different kinds of permissions here. So you can set a maximum number of 5 access policy on the table, container, queue, or shared at a given point of time. That means at the same time, you can only apply the 5 policies here. The change can be updated on the storage access policy, and it will take only 30 seconds to update the change. So whatever the specific policy you have defined earlier and accordingly you wanted to change it, you can go and change it based on your need. And then whatever the accessibility users were getting using the previous access policy, after updating the settings, they will get the permissions based on the newest updated rule. If they haven't met that criteria, then they will get the error of 403 forbidden status code over to their accessibility. Talking about the different kind of authorization option that can be utilized in the storage account. So we can utilize the Azure Active Directory, the very first, for accessing your storage account. The second is talking about the shared key. The third is talking about anonymous access to the containers and blobs. And the fourth one is shared access signatures. So these are the 4 different authorizations options we are having in the list. Using them, we can start accessing the data from the storage account. Azure Active Directory is going to be utilized in that scenario once we are creating the device identities or maybe the application identities for my resources. Shared access key will going to help me to create a kind of access policy, and based on that to provide the accessibility towards my different users. Anonymous access can be enabled on a geographical node. We can enable the blob to be accessed on a anonymous basis or maybe on a shared basis. If we are defining as a private container, then the person will not be able to access the blob from that container. Talking about the shared access signature, so it will going to be allowed to provide the permission to access the private blob using a specific URL. Talking about the storage encryption. So if you wanted to encrypt your data at rest, whatever you have stored in the storage account, so in that scenario, you can come up to this area called encryption on your resource. And from the encryption area, you can select what kind of encryption do you want it to implement. Do you want it to implement the encryption using the Microsoft managed key? That means Microsoft is going to utilize his own managed key, and accordingly, they are going to encrypt the data. You just need to confirmed whenever you wanted to decrypt that data, the data will going to be decrypted at the same time whenever you will going to access it via full permission. Second one is we can also create a kind of a encryption at rest using the customer managed key. But under the customer managed key, we just need to utilize one another service of Azure known as Azure Key Vault. Using the Azure Key Vault, we need to prepare a key, and then using that key, we can actually go for creating the storage encryption using the customer managed key. So it will going to help me to encrypt my data at rest and also the encrypt data at transit. So based on that, by default, if we are selecting the Microsoft managed key, so they will going to utilize the encryption of 256-bit AES encryption. This is going to be algorithm method that is going to be utilized by the Microsoft here. Moving forward to that, if I'll talk about the different kind of third-party tools or the Microsoft tools we can utilize to work with my storage services on a bulk note. So we can work with the Azure Storage Explorer. Azure Storage Explorer is a kind of a utility tool or a kind of a application tool that will going to install on your machines physically. And then you can open that tool, connect your Azure subscription, and then manage each and everything from your own system. The second way is talking about import and export service. So the import and export service is going to be utilized in that scenario when you wanted to upload lots of data at the same time. Let's suppose I do wanted to deal 100 TB of data to be uploaded in the Azure, or maybe I just wanted to download 100 plus TB of data from the Azure towards my internal on-premises environment. So in that scenario, we cannot do it on a public internet basis on that connectivity area. We need to utilize this service called import and export service. So what Microsoft will going to do in this area, it will going to generate me a import job or the export job depending upon our need. If we do wanted to store the data in the Azure, then our import job is going to be created. If I wanted to export the data from the Azure, in that scenario, export job needs to be created. So if I'm creating an import job, let's suppose on my on-premises data, whatever I'm having, I just wanted to upload all of them to the Azure, and accordingly, I'm creating an import job. So while creating the import job, I need to specify what is my data center's address. Then the Microsoft will going to send me some sort of hard disk at the SSDs, and then we need to copy that data into those SSDs, and then we need to send that SSD back to the Azure's data center location, and then they will going to associate this disk into their data centers, and accordingly the data is going to be accessible by us over to the portal. Same way in the export job, they will going to copy the data into the different shared drive disk, and accordingly they will going to share that disk with us to get myself a data to be copied in my on-premises environment. So this is a specific process how it's going to be done. The next tool we are having in line is talking about the AZ copy. So the AZ copy is going to be a method of a CLI environment. So if you guys wanted to work with the CLI environment to manage each and every aspects of your data, like creating or updating, viewing data, or maybe the deleting the data. So in that scenario, you can work with the AZ copy utility. You can directly install it in the Windows, and over to the Windows, you can access the AZ copy tool from the CMD environment. And in the Linux, you can actually access it using the bash shell environment. So over there, you can run some commands called AZ copy create, AZ copy view, AZ copy delete, and accordingly you can define what you need to create, what you need to delete, or what you need to view. So this is how the tools can be utilized. Under the storage services, there are two options are available. The very first is object replication, and the second one is the full data replication. So if I am saying that I do wanted to replicate my each and every objects which I'm having in a single container towards any other storage account in any other container on a replication basis. So over there, we can opt for this service called object replication. And once I'm selecting the object replication area and whatever the two different storage account am I selecting, let's suppose one is ST101, second one is ST102, and I'm creating the object replication from ST101 to ST102. So in that scenario, whenever I'm going to upload a new blob in the ST101, the same files is going to be replicated towards this storage account as well, and we can utilize this storage account as a backup account for ourselves. The next one is talking about the replication of my own data. So it's also going to be applicable. We're going to discuss this. Talking about the object replication only, so it will require a minimum latency. First of all, it will going to have a cost optimization option that's available. It will improve my efficiency for the workloads, and also the data distribution optimization is going to be available. Based on that, we can easily replicate the things and access the things depending upon our need. Other than that, if we are opting for a replication scenarios on my whole data environment, like I am saying that whatever the storage account am I creating, so by default Microsoft is going to create a 3 copy of that storage account just to provide you a backup of your data in any of the scenarios whenever a kind of a disaster recovery or any other kind of uh, things will going to be happen. Accordingly, the Microsoft is promising that they will going to save your data. So based on that, they will going to create you the 3 copy. So over there, we can opt what kind of replication method we wanted to implement in that scenario. We can opt for LRS, known as the local redundant storage, that will help me to create each and every copy on the same data center where my data is stored. The ZRS technology will going to help me to create these 3 copies of my data. One is on my own data center where I'm directly working. Two is going to be created on a different data centers in a different zones. So in a single region, we are having 3 to 4 multiple zones available. And in each and every zones, we are having the multiple data centers available. So the LRS will going to copy my data in the same data center. ZRS will going to copy my data into the different zones like zone 1, 2, and 3. GRS, known as geo redundant storage, will going to copy my data 3 times into the current region, and 3 times of its replication into the another region, talking about like West US or so on. Let's suppose I have my data storage to be created in the East US, and I'm selecting the GRS option over there. So Microsoft will create me the 6 copy of my storage account, and 3 of those copy are going to be stored in the same region called East US, and 3 of them are going to be created in the West US region, whatever their region pair options are available. So there is a concept of region pair in the Azure. Accordingly, in the another region, 3 copies are going to be stored over there. But it doesn't mandatory that where all those 3 copies are going to be stored, whether it will stored as a LRS basis or as a ZRS basis. If you do wanted to define those things, you can define it using the ZZRS option. So over there, what they will do, they will going to create the 3 copy in the current region, and all those copies are going to be stored in the different zones. Same way, whatever the other 3 copies they have created in another region, will going to store all of them in the different zones as well. So if their zones are still not working, still your data will going to be available to you. Talking about to another option here called RAGRS and RAZZRS. So these 2 options are only a read-only options of this GRS and GZRS. So in the GRS, all the 6 copies are going to be available for read and write both. But if we are working with the RAGRS, so only the current 3 copies of the same region will available for read and edit, but the next 3 copies which has been created in another region, over to which we cannot edit the thing. We can just view the things, download the things, read the things. Same way in the GZRS, we can edit any of the copies of my data, but in the RAZZRS, whatever the 3 copies has been created in a different region, over to that, we cannot edit those copies here. So this is some different strategies we are having in the line talking about the replication strategies of your storage account of your data. Moving forward to that, if I'll talk about managing the file share. So what is a file share? We just discussed that file share is going to be act like a file server over to the Azure. So we can directly create a new file server in the Azure and we can connect that file server with my respective machines. So file shares is going to be connected to any of the virtual machines. Either you guys are working with the Windows, Linux, or the Mac OS. So in all types of machines, the file share can be connected. And the prerequisite for connecting the file share is you need to have your specific SMB sections to be enabled, and you need to ensure that your 445 port is enabled on your Windows machine. In the Linux, your drive is mounted. In the Mac OS, you need to mount the drive as well. So these are some specific options which is required to enable on your systems. And then from the file share option, you will find the full scripts for Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. You just need to copy the script, run the scripts on your machine, and accordingly, your machines are going to be created successfully or going to be connected successfully, and you will be able to access the file share on your own. So this is how the things are working. Moving forward to that, if I'll talk about creating the blob storage or a container. So here is the option available. You can utilize this option to create the blob. So in the first image of this area, it is showing that from the container area, you just need to select the plus container button. You need to specify the name of the container and the access level. Is it the access level is going to be a private one, public one, or blob level? So you can select one of out of these three. Private means no one can access the data. Public or blob will allow the external user to access your data if they are having the proper URL of your blob available. The next one is, once we have created the container, I wanted to upload a blob. So from inside the container, we just need to go and select the upload button. And then from upload area, we can get this kind of window in the right hand pane where I need to select my file, which I need to upload. And then we need to select some settings in this area. And accordingly, we can select the upload button to upload my blob in the containers. The next thing is that whenever you wanted to download that blob, which I'm already having in the containers. So for downloading the blob, you just need to select the blob's 3 dots at the last. And using that 3 dots, you will open these windows, these options. And from that area, you can click on the download button to download your blob as well. So this is how the process are going to be work. Moving forward to that, if I'll talk about, so in the storage account, there are going to be the 3 types of tiers that can be available. Very first is a hot tier. Second one is a cold tier. Third one is a archive tier. So the hot tier is going to be available for those kind of data that needs to be accessed frequently by your services, by your users, and so on, like the real-time data which is coming and going from for the applications or for the SQL servers and so on. So you can upload them as a hot tier blob in your environment. If you are having a kind of a data that needs to be access free on a monthly basis or a weekly basis, so in that scenario, you need to upload your data as a cool storage account, as a cool access tier. And also, if you are saying that you wanted to upload a kind of a backup data only, that can be utilized mostly in depending upon the needs only, not on a regular basis or not on the weekly or monthly basis, but on basis of the need only. So in that scenario, you can upload that kind of data to the storage account using this archive tier. The difference between them is, first of all, in the hot section, it will allow you to frequently access your data. It will going to charge you more than any one of them. And also it will give you a very lowest latency. Talking about, it will going to have a minimum data retention period of time. The cool frequency is going to be available for 30 days. That means you can store your data to the cool storage account for 30 days. And here you will get the higher access of your data and the lower transaction, higher transaction cost also, but lower storage account uh, payment. So whatever the storage cost is, it's going to be a lower in comparison of the hot one, but the transaction rate was going to be higher one in comparison of the hot section. If you are uploading the data for a backup section only, in that scenario, you can go for archive tier, where you can store your data for up to 180 days, and accordingly, it will take up to hours to access your data. Because in the archive tier, first of all, it will going to rehydrate your data to change it to the cool or hot, and then only you can access your data here. So for that process, it will take approximately hours of time to access them. So that's why we are recommending that if you are having the backup data, only those kind of data needs to be stored in the archive sections. Other than that, you can store it either in the hot ones, either in the cold ones. Talking about the blob lifecycle management. So whenever we are creating a container or a blob, so we can create some lifecycle management where I can decide that if my data is storing in the blob for more than 30 days without getting the access, I wanted to divert it from hot tier to the cool tier, or from cool tier to the archive tier. So in that situation, we can create some rules here. So in the rule section, it will going to help me in multiple ways. Like first of all, to change the tier whenever it's required, and also to manage my cost, and also to help me to decrease my cost in the environment. So over there, we can create three types of rules. The very first is move to the cool storage, move to the archive storage, or to delete the blobs. So here you can select what is going to be my last modified options, and accordingly how much time we need to wait. And then we can decide whether I wanted to divert it to the archive tier, or do I want it to delete the blob. So this is how the lifecycle management rules can be work. So that is something we are having relatively for the storage accounts. If you guys are having any kind of questions from this segment, you can put up your questions in the chat. Okay, so relatively for that segment, we are having some questions in line. Talking about the first question here, it's asking what is the order of operations to rotate the storage account access key? Is it option A, regenerate secondary access key, then regenerate primary access key, update connection string with secondary access key, and update connection string with primary access key? So what's your going to be the best answers, that what order we need to follow in terms of changing the storage access key for any of the services? So let's get your answers on the chat, and let me start a timer now. Okay, so the correct answer is going to be, first of all, we need to update our connection with the secondary storage key, because we know whenever we are creating the connection with the storage account, we were always connecting it using the primary key storage, primary storage key. So if I wanted to update that and I wanted to change the key, so in that scenario, first of all, I need to connect it with my secondary access key. Then I need to generate the primary access key. Then I need to connect my account again with the primary access key, and then I need to generate my secondary access key again, so that the conflict will not present of accessing the data from both the keys. So that is why the correct order is, first of all, we need to update the connection string with the secondary one, then we need to regenerate the primary, then we need to update it by using the primary, and then we need to regenerate the secondary access key again. So this is the correct order. Second question we are having in line is talking about, if you use a Microsoft storage account for storing large number of videos and audios file, you create some containers to store each type of file and want to limit the access to those files for specific periods. Additionally, the files can only be accessed through shared access signature. You need the ability to revoke the access to the files and to change the period for which users can access the file. What should you do in order to accomplish this is in the most simple and effective way? Is it your option A? You can create an SAS token for each user and delete the SAS token when you wanted to prevent the access. Or you need to go with option B. You can utilize the Azure Right Management Services to control the access to each file. Or you can opt for option C, implementing the storage access policy for each container to enable revocation of access and the change of duration. Or is it option D, periodically you need to regenerate the account key to control to the files? So let's get your answers on the chat and let me start the timer now. Okay, so the correct and efficient way to manage this scenario is going to be option C. We can work with the access policies and accordingly we can decide when to revoke, what is my time limitation. But option A is also the correct one, but over there we need to do it on a manual effort basis. However, the access policy will help me to do it in a automated way without having any kind of manual intervention. So the correct answers is going to be option C here. Okay, so that is something we were having in this second objective domain of this course here. Now we are having the third domain talking about deploying and managing the Azure compute resources. So before talking about the third objective domain, let's get a coffee break in here. And after coming from coffee break, we're going to discuss about the third objective domain. Till the time, enjoy your coffee, guys. Okay, welcome back again after the quick break. So we were discussing about our third objective domain of this course, talking about deploying and managing the Azure compute resources in here. So let's get started. So inside this one, we're going to discuss about the four different concepts. The very first is automate the deployment of resources by using some templates. Second one is creating and configuring the Azure VMs. Third one is creating and configuring the containers. And the fourth one is creating and configuring an Azure app services. So these are some basic services that can be utilized to work with the compute aspects of the Azure environment. So whenever we were talking about deploying some resources to the Azure, so for working in the Azure, we have the multiple clients that can help us to work with the Azure environment. The very first options we can utilize, the very first tool we can use is known as the Azure portal. So whenever we do wanted to work on a GUI mode, like in a graphical interface mode, we can directly visit towards the Azure portal by working with a URL called portal.azure.com, and accordingly, we can manage the things from the Azure portal. The second way of working them is a Azure PowerShell. So if some of you guys are very well versed with the Microsoft Windows services and you know about working with the PowerShell and using the PowerShell environment, you wanted to manage the Azure, you can work with the Azure PowerShell in that scenario. And we can visit the Azure PowerShell by using a URL called shell.azure.com. The next one is Azure CLI. So Azure CLI is a kind of a tool that can be installed in your system, and from your system itself, you can open the CMD area, and from the CMD area, you can connect with your Azure CLI and can manage your whole Azure environment using that Azure CLI tool also. And the fourth one is talking about the REST clients. That means whatever the other client options we are having, like Visual Studio Code, or maybe like if the organization has its own management tools, so they can also integrate their own management tools with the Azure to manage the Azure services directly. So these are the tools that can help us to deploy any kind of services over to the Azure, and all of them are known as the SDK tools, and all of them are working over to a specific area called Azure Resource Manager. So the Azure Resource Manager is an area that will help me to deploy the services in the Azure. Over there, whatever kind of services am I deploying? Am I deploying the data store, web app, virtual machine, service management, or containers, Kubernetes, anything? Everything will going to be deployed using the Azure Resource Manager section. And Azure Resource Manager, we can work on them using any of the tools what we are working in here. Talking about the overview of Azure Resource Manager, so overview of Azure Resource Manager, over there it will going to provide me a consistent management layer. It will help me to deploy updates, delete on a single resource, or maybe a coordinated operations. That means with the resource, if I wanted to deploy the VM, whether I wanted to deploy the virtual network, storage account, containers at the same time, using the ARM template, we can directly deploy them and make connections between them. We can also provide the security, auditing, and tagging features while deploying something using the ARM template, and we can select the specific rest of the tools which we want, and by using the API calling, we can actually deploy the things here. Talking about creating the VM, so how my VMs can be created? So for creating a VM, you can either select the ARM template to create it. Either you can visit the Azure portal directly, or you can work with the Windows PowerShell or CLI mode. Then you just need to select the virtual machine service, that is a VM service in the Azure. And then from there, you need to click on the create button. After clicking on the create button, on the top, you will find these different options that needs to be filled, like basic details of your VM, disk detail which you wanted to associate, networking details, management details, some advanced information about the additional tools you wanted to implement or not, some tagging related scenario, and review and create area. So over there, you can select your basic requirements like the project related details, what is going to be your VM name, what is going to be your VM administrative account, administrative password, or maybe which image do you want it to deploy, what kind of size do you want it to select, that either you wanted to work with 2 virtual core of CPUs in your VM, maybe you wanted to implement a VM that has 4 virtual core of CPUs in it. So accordingly, you can select the things. After selecting the things, in the disk sections, you can define which kind of disk do you want it to implement. Like if you are implementing a OS disk, so which type of disk is it going to be? Is it going to be a kind of a premium disk, standard SSD, standard HDD, or maybe a normal HDD? So you can select the type of the disk. You can also associate an additional disk on your machines. Like if I'll say, apart from the OS disk, I wanted to associate a data disk also. So we can associate that data disk over there while creating a new data disk, or maybe we are having some existing VSD files in the Azure, we can directly call that VSD file also to connect with my machine. In the networking area, we can decide how the network is going to be flowed inside my VM area, what is going to be the specific virtual network I wanted to utilize, what is going to be the other services, and so on. In the management area, we can decide what is going to be my backup operations, that how the backup needs to be completed, needs to be done, how can we start monitoring the things, how we can actually set up something relatively for auto shutdown in on daily basis. So these options can be selected from the management area. In the advanced area, we can decide that after deploying that service, do we want it to run as scripts in that machine for some additional services to be installed? If yes, I can associate that script, and the script will going to be run in a periodical manner. So accordingly, we can decide these things in the advanced sections while creating. Talking about the different VM size, so here is a list of the different VM size that are available, and depending upon your need or the business case or the project case, you can select the type of the VM sizes from the list. Like, do you want it to go for the A series VM, B series, D series, DC series? So each and every VM series will have a different perspective to utilize. Like it is and for entry level of dev test, it is for economical bursting, it is for general purpose compute, is it for protect data in use, is it for in memory hyper threaded, do you want it to go for compute optimize, memory storage optimize, high performance computing, and so on. So accordingly, you can select the respective size of a VM from the different series. Talking about moving the specific resource from one resource group to another. So this is also a possible thing, we can achieve it. Like if we are having a specific resource group 1 available and I wanted to divert that VM from resource group 1 to resource group 2 on a different subscription, so I can easily go and move it to the different resource group towards a different subscription by selecting the move options from the top and by selecting which kind of movement we required, whether it is going to be my another resource group or is it going to be my another subscriptions in the list. Talking about the data disk. So in the data disk area, you can go and select a new option to create a new data disk on your side by using this option called create and attach a new disk. If you guys are already having some VHDs stored in your storage account and you wanted to associate them as a part of your data disk of your VM, so in that scenario, you can go for attaching some existing disk from the list. And accordingly, you can select the options. Talking about the VM network settings. So while creating the VM, you need to associate a kind of a network interface that is automatically going to be assigned towards your VM in the Azure. You need to specify that NIC address, and the NIC address could be a private or public. So the two types of address are going to be associated. Very first is a private one. So the private IP address is going to be assigned from the selected virtual network which I have created, like whatever my subnets IP address range it. From that range, any of the IP address can be associated. Other than that, in the public sector, we can create some public IP and then we can associate that public IP to the VM if I wanted to allow my user to access that VM from the public internet. So over there, we can enable the things. If I want that machine cannot be accessed publicly, so over there, we do not have to assign the public IP address here. We can associate the respective virtual network and subnets which we wanted to associate. And also we can opt for network security groups in terms of managing some security rules of the traffic. So we can associate some network security groups, we can create the rules in it. And also we can opt for load balancers if it's required. Talking about configuring the VM on a high availability. So whenever you are deploying a virtual machine and you wanted to create them as a high availability resource, so you have two options to achieve that goal. The very first option is you can go and select the availability set over there while creating the high availability scenario, or the second one, we can create it as a availability zones. So the availability sets, whatever we are having for redundancy, will going to help us to understand how many fault domains and update domains to be required to manage my resources. That means my copies of my VM are going to be created, but they are going to be created inside a single data center. But because I'm selecting the fault domain and update domain, so accordingly, the server is going to be changed on that same data center. So over there, I'm saying that we can select a fault domain up to 3 and we can select the update domain up to 20. So accordingly, my server place is going to be changed to select them. So on the single server, two of my VMs are not going to be deployed at any time. So every time if one of my server will down, still my machine will going to be available from another server which we are having in the same data center. The second option we are having is availability zones. So the availability zones is going to be utilized in that scenario when I wanted to replicate my VM into two different zones itself, so that if my one full data center is down, still I will be able to access the data or the machines. So in that scenario, we need to go for the availability zone option. So you can configure the multiple VMs in the availability sets. You can configure each applications into the separate availability sets. You can combine some load balancers also working with the availability sets and the other options in here. Talking about the scale sets. So we can also create the VM skill sets. Like if we wanted to work with the high availability and I wanted to opt for a kind of a service where I can create my multiple instances of the VM, or I can increase and decrease the size of the VM at any given point of time. So for that kind of achievement, we need to utilize another service, that is VMSS, virtual machine skill set service. So over there, we have two types of scaling that can help us to achieve that goal. The very first is a vertical scaling, and the second one is a horizontal scaling. Vertical scaling will help us to increase and decrease the compute size of my machine. Like if I have deployed my machine using the 4 virtual core of CPUs, and now I wanted to increase that number of core of CPUs from 4 to 10. So we can actually go for utilizing this vertical scaling, and then I can select what is going to be my limitation based on what condition, how much of CPU I wanted to increase. Same way talking about the horizontal scaling. So in the horizontal scaling, what it's going to done, it will going to create me an identical service at the same point of time whenever it's required. And once the requirement will complete, and after that, the same instance will going to be deleted also. So in the horizontal scaling, it will going to create me an identical service, but in the vertical scaling, it will going to increase and decrease the size of my compute of the machines. Talking about the auto scaling. So in the auto scaling, we can define the rule, and based on the rule, the specific options are going to be applicable. Like, is it my horizontal scaling or vertical scaling? Moving forward to that, if I'll talk about the Azure container instances. So what is that? So Azure container instance is going to be a very useful thing in the Azure. So Azure is providing us the option to directly deploy the container on the portal. Like for, I'll say the things relatively for deploying any kind of services like web server or application server, and you wanted to test them or you wanted to run them. So in terms of virtualization, we can opt for the containers over there for virtualization concept. So container is a very lightweight options we are having, and we can deploy the containers directly for working with the multiple service at the same time, because in each and every container we can have a different sets of library installed, we can have a different sets of tool installs that can support me a different sets of environment at the same place. However, we know if we are working with the virtualization concepts using my different virtual machines, so in a single virtual machines we can only install a single kind of library itself. But in the containers, so the containers is a very lightweighted, so at the space where I'm deploying one VM, I can deploy 100 of containers out of them. So the containers can also a very useful thing in terms of virtualization. So Microsoft is saying that if you do not have any of the infrastructure to deploy that containers and to utilize that container, so you can opt our service called as your container instance. I will provide you the infrastructure in the backend. What you need to do is you just need to deploy the container as much as you want, and you can start utilizing your containers depending upon your needs. So Microsoft is providing as a platform as a service over there, where they are providing the platform, we can opt for the service and we can utilize the service. So it is going to give me a faster startup times. It in the container, Microsoft will give me a public IP connectivity if I want it, or maybe be required, and also it will provide me the DNS name for it that is going to be a publicly accessible. It will give me a hypervisor level of security to over there, or we can create a container using the different sizes. You can decide about the virtual core of CPUs, memory, and so on. It is going to have a kind of a non-persistent storage. So over there, the storage will not going to be permanently available if we do wanted to create a persistent storage. So Microsoft is offering us some services. Over to that, we need to utilize some Azure Kubernetes services tool that will help me to create a kind of a persistent storage here. Other than that, we can also go and deploy a Linux-based containers, Windows-based containers. We can create some core scheduled groups. We can have some virtual network deployment to be available for working with the different sets of containers here. So that is how the container things are working. Moving forward to that, if I'll talk about Azure Kubernetes services, so Azure Kubernetes services is going to be a kind of a service which will help me to deploy multiple containers at the same time. The container instance will help me to create one single container in the Azure, but the Kubernetes service will help me to deploy and manage thousands of containers at the same time. So over there, it will going to create me a whole dedicated environment where I can deploy as much of container as we want in terms of virtualization. So it will help me to manage the health monitoring of those containers and also the maintenance of them. We will be able to perform the simple cluster scaling. We will be able to enable the master node to be fully managed by the Microsoft. So the things will going to be managed by the Microsoft relatively for the infra, but apart from them, we can manage each and everything on our own. Moving forward to that, we are having next service in the place called Azure App Services. So the Azure App Services will going to help us to focus solely on a development of a new app. Is it going to be your web app? It's your mobile app, it's your tablet app, doesn't matter. Whenever you wanted to develop a full app and you wanted to have an infra where you can host that application, so Azure App Service will going to provide you that platform where you can host your application, whatever you have deployed. And over to that, it will going to give you a different environment to deploy a different kind of codes. Like you can deploy it using your .NET codes, using your Python code, using your Ruby code, using your Java code, and any of them. So it will going to be focused on solely on the applications and the data. We can easily go and create the application services onto the Azure. It will help me to have some different deployment slots available. Deployment slots means that if I have created an app and I have deployed that app in the Azure, and now my app is working and many of the users are currently working with that app. Later on, I do wanted to make some change on my app, but before going app towards the live scenario, I wanted to deploy that code in the Azure and wants to test it. So once the testing will pass, only then I wanted to divert it to the live section. So Azure App Service will help me to provide a service here called a deployment slot, where I can create and opt multiple deployment slots, and accordingly, the codes can be transferred among them. So once I have make a changes, I can push that specific changes towards another deployment slots which I'm having, and using the URL of that deployment slots, I can test my functionality, test my services, and once everything is fine, what I can do is I can directly swap the slots so that latest changes will going to be implemented onto my current environment, and accordingly the things are going to be worked. So this is how the things are working in the deployment slots area. While creating the Azure App Services, we do need to create some Azure App Service plans here. So over there, we can define under which region this plan is going to be worked, number of VM instances that is going to be created, and also what is going to be my size of the VM. So whenever we are selecting a SKU and size, here I can decide what is my plan, what is going to be my total compute specific compute optimization unit, and also what is my memory. So you can select the same sizes here, you can select the region where it's going to be deployed, and also on which operating system is it going to be work. Talking about creating and managing the app services, so you can start creating your app services by giving a unique name towards your app, and you can access that specific app onto that domain called azurewebsites.net. You can publish the code or Docker container over to it. You can select the respective operating systems that needs to be enabled. You can go and select the respective region where do you want it to deploy it. You can select the specific app service plan to work with them. Talking about securing the app services, so for securing them, you can add a third-party identity provider. Either you can add the Azure Active Directory or maybe a kind of another third party, depends on your situation. You can go and troubleshoot it using some diagnostic logs area. You can add some SSL certification also, binding with the codes. You can also define the priority order of allowing and denying the list. You can also store some keys in your Azure Key Vault to directly access some confidential data from the different locations like a storage account or from the SQL servers. You can configure some domain names as well, like using which domain name do you want it to allow your users to access that specific services, like multiple ones. You can also go and configure the backups of your applications. You can configure the network settings. You can configure the deployment settings and so on. So these are some different settings that can be help us to deploy a new app services in the list and also to manage them. So these are some different options that are available to us. So that is something what we are having in this third section of this AZ-104 examination here. If you guys are having any kind of queries accordingly, you can proceed with your questions in the chat. Okay, so based on the current segment, Oni, actually, you can get the recordings from the webinars.aspx websites of GTechLearn. So I'll let you know that how to access that recordings. Don't worry about that. And just after completing the session, just after 1 to 2 hours, you will be able to download it or view it from there. Talking about the PowerPoint slide, surely I'm going to give you guys a link for downloading the PowerPoint presentation on your own. So don't worry about that. Okay, so talking about some questions from this area. So the very first question we are having in the line is, you are running an application consisting of microservices that require the persistent storage. Which of the following solutions will provide the most optimal performance? Is it your option A, VM with a VHD file? Is it option B, VM with Azure files storage? Option C, containers with Azure disk. Option D, containers with Azure file. So let's get your answers on the chat and let me start the timer now. Okay, so the correct answer is option D. Container with Azure files will provide the most optimal performance in the Azure. The next question we are having, in this image, you can see which of the following resources are deployed using this ARM template. So you can read out the ARM template and accordingly you can select. Is it your storage account? Is it your network security group, load balancer, or public IP? You need to select how many resources are deploying using this ARM. It can be one service, it can be two services. So let's get your answers on the chat and let me start the timer now. Okay, so the correct answer is A and B depending upon this image. And in this image, you can see it is deploying with a storage account, network security group, virtual network, network interface, virtual machine. Public IP is not installed, so we cannot add the public IP in the answer. Only the option A and B is the right answer here. Okay, so that is something we were having in this third section of this course called AZ-104. Now moving forward with the fourth segment, where we are going to discuss about configuring and managing the virtual networking. So let's get started. So under this specific module, we're going to discuss about the four different concepts, talking about configuring the virtual networks, configuring the secure access to the virtual networks, configuring the load balancing, and monitoring the virtual networking in the list. So let's get started. So whenever we were talking about the Azure networking, so how the networking is work in the Azure. So inside the Azure, if you wanted to work with the networking concept, you need to utilize one of the service called VNet, known as virtual network in the Azure services. It will give you a logical representation of your own network. It will help you to create an instance of a private cloud. It will going to give you an option to create a hybrid cloud scenario support. And also it will help you to go ahead and work with one or more subnet segments in it. What is a subnet? So it will going to provide you the logical divisions within your network, and it will help you to improve the security. So just like in our infrastructure, we are having a LAN option available known as local area network. So the same work is going to be done by the VNet to us in the Azure cloud. Whatever the concept of the LAN, same concept is applied for the VNet. So whenever I wanted to create a private network on the Azure cloud for connecting my different services with each other, we can easily go and create the VNet. In the VNet, I can define my address range. Let's suppose I'm defining this address range called 10.0.0.0/16. This is my address range. Under this address range, if I say I wanted to create multiple subnets, so for creating the different subnets, we can define the address accordingly. Let's suppose I'm creating the first segment using the 24, and then I'm creating another segment 1.0/24, and same way for the others. So we can easily go and decide a kind of a specific segments are we trying to create. So just like the way we are creating the LAN and subnets in the on-premises, same way we can do it on the Azure using the VNet services. Talking about the VNet peering, so whenever I am saying that you guys are creating the multiple virtual networks in the Azure, so by default, whatever the resources I have associated under those VNets are not going to be accessible by the other VNets itself. Like if I'm having a VM in the VNet 1, and if I'm having a VNet in a VM in the VNet 2. So by default, VM2 will not be able to access the VM1 here. That is going to be the predefined condition. However, inside the same VNet, if I'm having a VM3 and VM5 and VM6 available, so all those VMs will be able to access each other because they are in the same virtual network. However, if those VMs are associated in the different subnets like subnet 1, subnet 2, subnet 3, and subnet 4, still all of them can connect with each other because it's available in the same VNet. When it comes working with the multiple VNets, so by default, multiple VNets will not allow the communication with each other. So for providing the communication with each other, we just need to create a VNet to VNet peering. And we can easily find that option from inside of your virtual network resource. From inside of your virtual network resource, you need to come to the VNet peering option on the left hand side. You will find that option. And from that area, you need to go for plus add to create a new VNet peering. And then you need to select from which VNet do you want it to peer a connection. Once you will peer it, then both ways, the bi-directional option is going to be created. That means from first VNet to second and from second to first. In both directions, the connection is going to be created, and accordingly, the communication will going to start open over there. So we are having two different types of peering. The very first is regional VNet peering. Second one is global VNet peering. Difference is both options are going to be work in the same manner, but the difference is regional VNet peering is going to be applicable to that place where I'm having the VNet in the same region. Like in the East US, I have created both the VNets, VNet 2 and VNet 3. So if I'm creating the peering between these two networks, it will going to be known as the regional VNet peering. If I'm having another VNet in another region, like these two are having in the East US and the next one we are having in the West US, and now I'm creating the peering between them. So over there, this kind of peering is going to be known as the global VNet peering. One more thing, guys, that if I am connecting one of the VNet with second VNet, and if I'm having that VNet connection is already connected with another ones like VNet 3 or VNet 4. So in that situation, I do not need to create the peering between all of them. Like if I'm having these three VNets are available, let's suppose we are talking about this option here. I am saying that in the first region called West US, I'm having a VNet 1. In the East US, I'm having these two specific VNets, VNet 2 and VNet 3. And over there, I'm connecting VNet 1 with VNet 2 by using a method called global VNet peering. And in the backend, I have already connected the VNet 2 to VNet 3 using the regional VNet peering. So by default, the resource of VNet 1 will be able to access the resource of VNet 3. However, we haven't created the connection directly. Because we have a connection created using a common VNet, that is VNet 2, and because of this, we will be able to access each and every resource from each and every uh, network in here. So that is also a one concept in here. If we haven't connected this peering in that situation, and I have only connected the VNet 1 with VNet 2, and I wanted to access the resource of VNet 3 from VNet 1, so in that scenario, I need to create that direct peering over there. And once I will connect the direct peering, then VNet 2 will also be able to access the resource of VNet 3. So that is something we are having in the list in the Azure. Talking about the architecture of virtual network. So just like this image, if we are creating a whole virtual network, so inside the whole virtual network, we can create as many subnets as we want. Inside the each and every subnets, we can have the NICs available. NICs is known as a network interface card, which is associated with the single virtual machine here. So every time I'm creating a VM, I'm creating the NIC. We can directly connect it inside the subnet, and inside the subnet, it will going to be associated with the virtual network here. And that's how the networking operations will going to be run. So these ones are known as the virtual network. If I do wanted to create it, connect it to the on-premises, we can directly go and create it with the on-premises using the VPN connections or the express route connections. Talking about some other networking resources we are having in the list. So we are having a lots of resources here. The very first is network interface card. So the network interface card is going to be known as the Ethernet card or the LAN card also. That is going to be associated with my virtual machines to provide the communication ability over to the network. The next one is talking about a network security group. So the network security group is going to be a kind of a group which will help me to create some rules and regulations to filter my network traffic in here. Like what kind of traffic I wanted to divert on what basis, we can create all those rules from here. Talking about the load balancers. So the load balancers are going to be a kind of a service available, which will help me to divert the load into the different VMs in the backend, depending upon of how much load we are getting from the customer side. Talking about the Azure DNS. So Azure is providing us two different types of DNS services. First one is a private DNS. Second one is a public DNS. So if you wanted to create a DNS service on your own inside the Azure network for internal purpose only, that means whatever the VNets we are having, whatever the machines we are having in that VNet, using that DNS record only, they can find out the respective destinations where I wanted to divert them. In that scenario, we can work with the private DNS. Once I am saying that the resource of my Azure cloud will be able to access my public environment also, but depending upon my own DNS network, whatever I am having the DNS records, all using them, I wanted to work with. So over there, we can create the public Azure DNS service that will help me to connect my resources with the public internet using my own DNS records. Same way, we are having the public IP address. So the public IP address needs to be associated to those resources to whom we wanted to allow them to connect it with the public internet here. So these are some services we are having. Let's talk about those services one by one in the overview section. So talking about the Azure DNS. So whenever we were talking about a DNS service, so what is a DNS service? The full form of DNS is a domain name system, which will help me to convert my IP addresses into name and my names into IP addresses. That is the main work of the DNS, and that's how the DNS is working. So over there, if I'm having my own DNS server where I'm already created some records, using my on-premises servers which I'm having, and accordingly I wanted to utilize and call those records in my different machines to access those resources. I can create the Azure DNS, associate that DNS server to that, and accordingly the records can be accessed by the different machines. So it will allow the host to manage domains by using a globally distributed name server, or maybe the internally distributed name server. In both areas that can be applicable. Like if you're working with the public DNS, over there the globally distributed name server is going to be applicable. If you're only working with your on-premises network or maybe the internal network in the cloud, so over there the private DNS can be useful. Next one is it will also allow you to manage all your domains by using your existing Azure credentials. So whatever the domain servers do you wanted to utilize, how many of them you are having, you can opt for any one of them in here. By default, in the global size, on a public note, we are having 13 DNS servers are installed all over the globe. So if you are not associating your own DNS servers for name resolution query, in that scenario, Azure will going to opt up using some public addresses as well, relatively for the DNS. It will also going to be act as a state of authority for the domain, because in this area, each and every detail is going to be available relatively for each and every IP addresses. Features which is available in the Azure DNS is, first one is a security feature that will going to help me to create a secure connections between IP address to name. It will easy to use. It will help me to connect my multiple private domains with itself. It will also help me to create some alias record over there. That means a CNAMEs record, which will help the users to find the services in a more quick manner. Talking about the NSG. So NSG is known as the network security group in the Azure. We can create the NSG in the Azure and we can associate this network security groups directly with my subnets, directly with my NICs. In both scenarios, we can associate the NSG rule, and whatever the NSG rule I have enabled, accordingly, the network traffic will going to be flow. So it will going to contain a list of security rules, which we are allowing or denying on a inbound and outbound network traffic. It can be associated to a subnet or to a network interface. Talking about the NSG rule, so you can implement and configure rules to filter traffic up to 5 tuple information. By default, there are going to be some security rules available. Two of them going to be on an outbound inbound node, and one of them is going to be an outbound node. So we can create both type of rules over there. We can also go and create some augmented security rules for multiple NICs and so on, which is connected with the same subnet. Talking about the application security group. So whenever I am saying that I'm creating an NSG here, in a specific rule of my network security groups, I am saying that if I am having one of the machine in my server, let's suppose we are having a data server in here. We are having the data server data 1, and we are having a VM1 available. And I wanted to say both of them are in the same subnet, but still I'm creating a rule that only VM1 can access the data 1 in here. So I can create a rule, I can decide how the network is coming, and accordingly we can allow and deny the ports, and depending upon them we can create the rule that VM1 can access the data 1 here. Same way I'm saying, because it's going to be a single rule, I am saying that using the VM1, because it's a public access in the VM1 is available, it's my app server which is running. An app server is taking that connection from the data service, from the data server. It's getting the data from there. Same way we are having some additional app server also, like app 2 and app 3. Now I am saying that all those apps need to have the same access of the data servers. So over there in the NSG section, what we need to do is we need to create 3 rules for 3 of them. But if we are implementing another concept here called application security groups, which we are having. So what application security group will help us? It will going to help us to collect all those machines and app servers on a single place. And then we can create a new NSG rule, which will allow that this application security group can access the data from this data server, and accordingly whatever how many VMs we are having under this application security groups, all of them will going to have a access of that data at a same place. So we do not have to create the multiple rules in that situation. So this is how the application security groups is going to be work. Talking about the Azure firewalls. So just like we are having the corporate firewalls in our companies, same way Azure is providing yourself a new firewall service on a platform as a service basis in the Azure cloud. You can create your own Azure firewall over there. You can create your own rules. You can create your own routing techniques, and accordingly you can secure your environment. So in the Azure, it will going to provide you the high availability. Like locally, you guys need to have some different kinds of servers. The infrastructure needs to be available for working with the high availability scenario. But in the Azure, you do not require any kind of infrastructure to be deployed. You can directly operate in the cloud, and every time your firewall will need a kind of a infrastructure to manage the resources. Every time the infrastructure will going to be increased or decreased depending upon the situation or the depending upon the needs we are having. So it will going to provide us a high availability. Over to that, we can create the multiple availability zones in here, depending upon which my replication can be enabled. It will give me an unrestricted cloud scalability. It will help me to work with the FQ-driven filtering rules, fully qualified domain name filtering rules. It will help me to manage my network traffic filtering rules. It will help me to create, enforce, and log application, some network connectivity policies, and so on. It will also going to help me to work with the threat intelligence based filtering. It will also help me to have a multiple IP address associated with the same firewall that can be utilized in a different way. So these are some basic specific features we are having in the Azure firewall. Talking about creating an Azure firewall, so how can we start creating it? So whenever you wanted to create a new firewall, you can directly deploy the firewall platform as a service on your Azure. And once you are having the Azure firewall installed, you can directly monitor it using the Azure Monitor. Second one is whenever you have created a new firewall, you can associate all your resource subnets, how many subnets you guys are having, directly to the Azure firewall. And also you can create your on-premises servers to be connected with this Azure firewall by using the VPN gateway connectivity. So using the VPN gateway, you will be able to secure them using the Azure firewalls in here. So every time a request will going to be come towards this firewall first, and based on the request is coming, it is going to verify where to transfer the request. Accordingly, it is going to transfer the request to the on-premises as well as to the relative services which we are connected from the cloud itself. Talking about a next service we are having in line. So the Microsoft is providing me an additional service of Azure Bastion services in the Azure, which is going to help me to work on a telnet protocol. Sorry, not a telnet protocol. It's going to be actually work on a TLS protocol over there. So using the TLS protocol, Microsoft is saying that if you are deploying the VM in the Azure and you wanted to access the VM, so you can directly access the VM using the TLS connection without having the need of opening of any of the port of your machine. That means if I'm deploying the Windows machine and I'm taking the remote session of the Windows machine using the RDP services, so I need to enable the port number called 3389. Same way for the Linux machine, if I'm taking the remote session of the Linux machine, I need to enable the SSH services port number 22. But Microsoft is saying we are providing you a more authenticated way to access your resource without having any kind of uh, possibilities of opening any of the networking port on your machine. You can opt a service for Azure Bastion over there. So Azure Bastion will going to create you a private way using the TLS connection, and accordingly you can access your machines over there. And on your machines, you do not have to open any kind of network ports over to it. So with a single click, we can take the remote session of each and every machines, whether it's my Windows machines or Linux machines or so on. No public IP is also required. That means if your machine is not having the public IP, still we will be able to take the remote access. We just need to deploy the Bastion host in our services, and the users can connect in a portal using the HTML5 browser. So using the HTML browser, you will be able to connect them. You just need to select the respective VMs which you wanted to connect with the Bastion services. So just like we are having a user, we are opening the Azure portal on the Chrome browser. In the Azure portal, I just need to select the Azure Bastion service, and in the backend, whatever the VM I have defined, the same VM access can be available here, and we will be able to access them. Apart from that, Microsoft is also providing us some options to create some service endpoints on the subnets. Like I am saying that I'm creating some virtual network, and in each and every different virtual networks, we are having some subnets. So let's suppose on a virtual network A, I'm having a subnet called 1, and in this subnets, my all the app services are deployed all over my app services infrastructure. How many apps we are running in the company, all of them are deployed in this subnet. Now I am saying that the data of this app services is installed and is present into another network or maybe another subnet like subnet 2 or subnet 3, and I wanted to create a direct connection with that service to access that kind of data from there. So in that scenario, we can create some service endpoints on the subnets, and we can directly define what kind of service can be connected from which of the subnet. So I am saying that we are having a storage account, and I wanted to access that storage account from this networking subnet. So I can create a service endpoint. I can go for my service endpoint creation from the storage account, and over there I can decide that from virtual network A, subnet 01 can access my storage account on their end. So from the app service, we will be able to access the storage account services here. Same way, we are having some private endpoints. So the private endpoint will going to be help me in that scenario when you wanted to connect your on-premises services with your Azure services directly. So over there, we can create some private endpoints. So the private endpoint will going to help me to secure my connection to connect my services with the Azure relative things without going publicly to the public internet, because we know that if we are creating the VPN, still that VPN is creating a private tunneling on the public internet. So by default, we were always going towards the public internet to access the thing, but the private endpoint will help me to connect my different services from the different network, from the different subnet with each other using a private tunneling without exposing my connection to the public internet. So using the Azure's bandwidth connection, the backend connections, the backbone connections, whatever the Azure has are having, accordingly we can access it using that connection only. So this is the private endpoint option we are available. Talking about the next service is a load balancer. So load balancer is going to be a kind of a front end way we are having a service that will help me to divert the load into a different places depending upon how much of load we are getting. Like I am saying, we are having one of the application server is running, and for the infrastructure of that server, I'm having 10 VMs installed in the backend, and all of 10 VMs are working against to that same app server. But I would say in a single machine, I have taken a kind of a compute as 4 virtual core of CPUs. That means in each and every machine, I'm only having the 4 virtual core of CPUs. So against that 4 virtual core of CPUs, I can only handle the 1,000 queries at the same time on that machine. If I'm getting the queries more than 1,000, then in that scenario, my machine speed will going to be down, and maybe we will take time to process the thing. So I am saying that I wanted to need a solution for it, where I would say that once the 1,000 request has been diverted towards my first VM, I automatically want to divert my 1,000 first request to my second VM, which I'm having in the backend. So for diverting those kind of loads, like the percentage of load or the network connectivity load, we can implement the load balancer in the front end. So every user will going to access the load balancer using the load balancer's public IP address in the backend, my machines are not going to have any kind of public IP address. They are going to connect with the private IP address with my load balancer. And over there, the loads is going to be diverted to the respective VMs whenever it's required. So it's going to help me in two ways. The very first is to divert the load. The second one is to secure my internal infra so that none of the external user can able to directly communicate with my VMs, or directly will not be able to directly, I'll say, to compromise my VMs in that scenario. So because machines are not having any of the public IP address, so the hackers will going to have a kind of a less chance to connect with my servers in that situation. Because if they are connecting with my public IP address, so it will always associated with the load balancer. So they will going to find the details of the load balancers, not my data or not my machines which I'm having in the backend. And accordingly, we can prevent the attacks. So this is my load balancers we are having. Under the load balancer, there are going to be some terms that are going to be utilized in a different way. The very first is a SKUs. So in the SKUs, we can define what kind of load balancer do you want it to deploy. Is it going to be a standard one? Is it going to be a basic one? So whenever I am saying that you want it to work as an internal load balancer, that means you are having the request coming from your internal organization, and accordingly you are diverting the request to the different servers depending upon the needs of the user. Over there we can work with the basic load balancer for my internal load balancer. If you guys are working with the public load balancer where the requests are coming from the public side, over there also you can opt for the basic one, but the specific recommendation is you can start working with the standard level of load balancer on a public node. So you can decide what kind of load balancer I wanted to operate, and in each and every tier you will find a different kind of load balancer which will give me a different kind of features to be available. So you need to select the respective plans accordingly while creating them. You can also go and select some backend pools. So we can create the backend pools. Under the backend pools, I can define what is going to be my VMs where my request needs to be diverted. So I can create a group of those machines and I can associate that group of machines in this backend pools. So accordingly, it is going to check which my machine is up, which my machine is down, to which machine the load needs to be diverted depending upon what condition. We can also define some session persistence consistency. We can define that how the client traffic will going to be handled. Like every time a user is logging into the websites, so how much time am I allowing them to make a continuous logging onto a same session? That means if they are on idle on the session for approximately of 5 to 10 minutes, so I can decide that I can ask them to re-log in again to get the newer details to be asked. So we can create the session persistence rules accordingly. We can utilize the health probe scenario. The health probe scenario will going to check out about my backend VMs. So it will going to communicate with my backend VMs and going to check the status, how many VMs currently are up and running and how many VMs currently are down. So if the machines are down, so it will not going to divert the load or to the traffic to that machine because that machine is down. We can also go and create some load balancing rules where I can decide which kind of data needs to be diverted to which kind of area or to which kind of servers in the backend. So we can always go and decide the things in here. Talking about the application gateway. So the application gateway will going to help us and going to help us to divert the traffic using the application layer of the machine of the networking. So we know that there's going to be a 7 layers of networking. So out of them, application gateway is going to be work on my application layer, that is layer number 7, where it is going to check me which kind of data I wanted to access. So just suppose that if I'm getting the access of my data relatively for images, so I can divert the data based on that. If I'm getting the access of my data relatively for videos, accordingly I can divert the request to another place. So every time I can decide what kind of applications data it's accessing by the user. Accordingly, we can decide to which server needs to be diverted. So over there, if the users are checking the data from the browser, it will going to check out using the app gateway frontend IP address. That means the request always will going to be come to the application gateway, and then it here we will going to install one of the HTTP and HTTPS listener. The listener's work is only to listen the query which has been asked by the customer. Then he needs to find the specific rules which we have already created in the HTTP settings, and based on the rules we have defined accordingly from the backend tool, we can divert the request here. Let's suppose we have created this server for images, we have created this server for videos, we have created this server for games. So I am saying if my user wants to access the game, so my HTTP will going to check the request that the user wants to get the access of the games. Accordingly, it will going to check the rule, and in the rules it's saying that if customer wants to get the access of the game server, then divert to the on-prem. So accordingly it is going to be diverted. So this is how the application gateway is going to be work. In the load balancer, it is going to be diverted using the number of requests we are getting, or the optimization of your servers in the backend. In those scenarios, it is going to be diverted, but in the application gateway, it will going to be diverted depending upon the kind of a application wants to access. Talking about some troubleshooting of the load balancing here. So there can be some basic sets of errors can be present every time. And if you do wanted to get the resolutions of those load balancing, so how can we actually resolve them? So let's talk about some basic scenarios. So the very first is, if I'll say that my load balancer connectivity is unavailable. So what we need to do is, we just need to go and ensure that the IP address of my clients are added towards my NSG allow list. If it's done, and if my load balancer has a public IP address available, in that scenario, the availability will going to be present. The second error is outbound connectivity from standard internal load balancer is unavailable. So over there, we can create the explicit public IP through outbound only configuration, or else we can utilize the NAT gateway on our subnets. Talking about the next error, relatively for backend port for an existing LB rule balancer cannot be changed. So in that scenario, you need to update the virtual machine skill set to remove the health probe, and then you need to update the port and configure the health probe again. If you are using that scenario, then you can actually go for changing the backend ports here. Next error we are having, let's say that a small traffic shows up in a load balancer even after removing the VMs from the backend pool or the load balancer. So over there, what is the resolution? First of all, you need to conduct a network trace to verify, and then you need to remove the VM within the Azure subscription. Then after, you can perform the NS lookup to determine the Azure IP and can check whether the traffic is still showing or not. If I'll say that the error is load balancer in the field state, so for the resolution of that scenario, you can go to the Azure Resource Explorer to identify the resource in the field state. You can update the toggle to read and write. You can click the edit for resource in the field state, and you can click the put for load back get to ensure that provisioning state is updated. So these are some errors, and these are some resolutions we are having in the list. Talking about how to monitor the Azure load balancer concepts, whether it is perfectly working fine or not. So you can go for creating a kind of a diagnostic reports using the Azure Monitor tool. So Azure Monitor is a tool of a networking of a monitoring tool in the Azure that is only the free condition. You do not have to pay anything about that. And over there, you can create some metrics, and using the different sets of metrics, you can monitor your load balancer or the other services also inside the single pane. You can also go and start working with the network watcher tool. So the network watcher tool will going to help me to improve my network connectivity in my environment, over to which we can utilize the first option of IP flow verify. That will help me to diagnose the network connectivity issue from one point to another. The second option is next hop. Over there, it will going to help me to determine whether my route is configured to that next step or not. Then we are having the next tool called VPN troubleshooting. So it will going to help me to troubleshoot my VPN gateways and the connections we have done accordingly. The next one we are having is NSG flow logs. So over there, it will going to help me to map about all kind of traffics that are coming from the network security groups, and will be able to monitor them. Next, we are having a tool called connection troubleshoot. So it will going to help me to troubleshoot the connections between the two different machines or two different resources, whatever kind of errors are coming. So you can troubleshoot them over there. You can get some recommendations. You can get some ML things to be working. You can also go and have your topology to be checked, that what kind of networking is it running on your environment and how the topology is going to be work like. So this is the different sets of options we are having in the network watcher. We can start utilizing them to work with. Same way for troubleshooting the external networking, we are having some errors and the resolutions accordingly. So you can take the screenshot of it and you can get some informations on your own, like what kind of errors we can follow and accordingly what resolutions we need to provide. So this is our first page and this is going to be a second page. So that is something we are having inside this section of networking and connectivity area. If you guys are having any kind of questions from this domain, you can put up your queries in the chat box now. Okay, so let's move ahead and talk about some question and answers from this segments, what we just discussed here. So the very first question we are having in the list is, if I'm saying that your company has an existing Azure tenant that names with alpineskihouse.onmicrosoft.com, and the company wants to start using alpineskihouse.com for their Azure resources, you are going to add a custom domain towards your Azure for working with this domain called alpineskihouse.com. And now you need to add some DNS record to prepare for verifying the customer domain. So what kind of records do you want it to add on your public DNS registrar? Option A, you need to create a PTR record over there. Option 2, you need to select create TXT record over there. Option C, you need to create MX record over to your domain registrar, or you need to create a SRV record, that is your service record, or maybe you need to go for working with the canonical record, that is your CNAME record in your domain registrar. So you need to select the respective correct answers. How many answers are correct? You need to select all of them. So let's get your answers on the chat and let me start a timer now. So the correct answer for that question is going to be a B and C. So whenever I'm adding a custom domain in the Azure, so on my public domain registrar portal, we need to add either the TXT record to verify that domain, or either to create the MX record, that is my mail exchange record, to verify my domain. So these two types of records will going to help me to verify my domain. Apart from them, if I'll talk about the PTR record, so the PTR record will only going to help me to divert a request towards one of my forwarded domain which I'm having. Talking about the SRV record, so it's going to be created whenever you wanted to create a service here. The CNAME record will going to help me to shorten my existing fully qualified domain name. So these are some different kind of domain records name we are having. Next question we are having in line is, you are planning your Azure network implementation to support your company's migration to Azure. Your first task is to prepare for the deployment of the first set of VMs with some basic requirements, like consumers on the internet must be able to communicate directly with the web applications on the VM, and the IP address configurations must be zone redundant. So you need to configure the environment to prepare for the first VM and to minimize the cost whenever possible, while still meeting the requirements of the customer here. So what should you do? Option A, you will create a standard public IP address, and during the creation of the first VM, you will associate that public IP address with the virtual machine's NIC. Or is it option B, you will create a standard public IP address. After the first VM is created, you will remove the private IP address and assign the public IP address to the NIC. Is it option D? You will create the basic public IP address during the creation of the first VM, associate the public IP address with the VM, or option D, you will create a basic public IP address. After the first VM is created, you will remove the private IP address and will going to assign a public IP address to the VM NIC. So what's your answers in this question here? So let's get your answers on the chat and let me start the timer now. Okay, so the correct answer is option A. You need to create a standard public IP address first, and then you need to associate that specific IP address while creating the VM in the Azure. So this is your first process you need to follow. So that is something we were having in that segment of network connectivity here. Now we are having our last segment of this course talking about monitoring and backing up the Azure resources in here. So let's get started with this domain now. So under this one, we're going to discuss about two different options. The very first is monitoring the resource by using the Azure Monitor and implementing some backup and recovery area. So let's get started. So whenever I am saying that we do wanted to monitor my different services which I'm having in the Azure, so what different kind of tools we can utilize in the Azure? So we can start utilizing the tool called Security Center to monitor my resources. We can work with the application insights. We can work with the Azure Monitor. So these three options we are having in the list that will help me to connect my services here to monitor my all those services. So the security center will manage the security of your infrastructure from a centralized location. Application insights will going to monitor the availability, performance, and the uses of your web applications, or depending upon whether they hosted on cloud or in the on-premises, doesn't matter. Azure Monitor will going to collect, combine, and analyze the data from different resources. So you can use any of the monitoring solutions on your own. Talking about the Azure Monitor, so Azure Monitor is a centralized tool and it is a free tool provided in the Microsoft Azure platform. You can opt for this service and you can connect your resources here and you can start monitoring them by creating the metrics, by creating the dashboards and alert sections and so on. For creating the alerts, you need to pay the charge. But for creating the metrics and the dashboards and for analyzing the things, you do not have to pay any kind of charge over there. This is a free of cost tool available. So in the Azure Monitor, you can detect and diagnose across applications and the dependencies with your application insights. You can correlate the infrastructure issue with Azure Monitor for VMs and Azure Monitor for containers. You can drill into monitoring the data with log analytics and application insights for troubleshooting and deep diagnostics. You can support the operations at scale with smart alerts and automated actions. You can go for creating some visualizations with the Azure dashboards and workbooks. You can note the alert dashboard from multiple subscriptions in the tenant. You can utilize the custom query language to pull the log and metrics records from the log analytics workspace area. So this is the capability of Azure Monitor we are having. Talking about the dashboards and the multiple subscriptions. So inside the Azure, you can get a new service known as the dashboard to be enabled. So the dashboard will going to help you to create the centralized dashboard of your whole environment using the multiple resource, using the multiple subscriptions and so on. You can easily go for connecting your own dashboard or else you can see the existing dashboard which is already been created. So depending upon your needs, depending upon your project you guys are working or the way you wanted to look your environment, you can go for creating your own dashboard. Once you have created your own dashboard, you can directly go and share that dashboard to the respective person in that scenario. Talking about setting up some alerts and actions. So over there inside the Azure monitor, you can go for selecting some, creating some alert and action. We just need to come to the alert area and then we need to go for creating the alert. So user can set the alerts by going towards the alert rule area by pressing this plus create from the alerts tab under the monitoring from here, from this place, and then the alert could be created. But for each and every alert you need to pay some much of amount over there. So whenever a alert will trigger, it will going to charge you accordingly. Until the alert is not triggering, you do not have to pay anything. And while creating the alert, it will going to show you how much of cost do you need to pay for this specific alert in your environment. You can also go and configure some monitorings for VMs, storage account, and networks by using the insights area. So in each and every resource in the bottom, you will find the insights option available under the monitoring section. And from that insights option, you will be able to see about their full details, like where this specific resource is hosted, what is the specific availability of that resource is available, what is the use case of it, and also how much of request we are getting, how much of request we are sending back, what times we are taking to resolve the queries and so on for sending a kind of a request again. So this is how we can actually go and have those things to be checked. You can go and monitor the request rates, response times, failure rates, dependency rates, response time, failure rates, exceptions, page view and load performance, AJAX call from WebEx, web pages, performance counters from Windows or Linux machine servers. You can get the host diagnostics for Azure or the Docker. You can go for having the diagnostics traits for logs from the apps. You can go and create some custom events and metrics in the client on the server mode. So these are some options that can be monitored from the insights area on a different sets of services we are working with. Next one we are having in the line is talking about the Azure backup. So what is a Azure backup? So Azure backup is a service. It is a fully cloud-based service we are having, and we can directly initiate a backup of our each and every VM workload. Also for my different resources which we are working as a platform as a service. So for all those things, we can initiate the backups and we can store the backups at a single place. We just need to create the storage account for it. And on the storage account, we can select where I need to create the backup. Depending upon what policy, accordingly, the things will going to be done. So it will allow me to take the offline on-premises backup. It will going to help me to back up my Azure infrastructure as a service like VMs. It will going to help me to get unlimited data transfer to be done using the backup method. It will going to help me to keep the data secure because we are diverting it towards my storage account, and then we can apply the specific solutions over to my storage account for securing the data. You can get the app consistency backups, like every time you are deploying the app services from inside the app services, you can have the Azure backup service available. Opt for that service and start taking the backup of that app itself every time. So whatever the platform as a service we are having for them, you will find the Azure backup directly associated with the plan. You can also go and retain and store your data on a short and long terms depending upon your need. You can automatically go and manage your storage management area. You can go for having the multiple storage options to be enabled depending upon what kind of backup do you want it to enable, whether you wanted to take the full backup, do you want it to take the partial backup, do you only want it to take the backup of a specific folder, of a specific drive. So you can easily go and select them, those things in here. So from the on-premises machine, you can directly take the backup on the cloud, and from the cloud itself, whatever the VMs we are having, you can initiate the backups over there. And for doing so, you need to install Azure Backup Agent on your machines, and then it's going to be done. From the Azure Backup Agent, you need to go and select configure the backup policy, where you are going to confirm which drives data needs to be backup, whether it's my all machines data, or maybe it's my only C drive or D drive, or maybe it's a specific folder only called folder 1 or folder 2. So you can easily decide each and everything, and accordingly the data will going to be backed up. Talking about restoring the data, so you can also go and restore your data itself whenever it's required using the same tool called Azure Backup Agent tool. Talking about the comparison between the Azure backup services and the site recovery services. So what is the difference between them? So the major difference between backup and site recovery is, in the Azure backup, we can only create the backup of my data, what we are working with. However, the service in which we are working, we cannot take the backup of the service itself. But the site recovery will help me to create my service replication also with the data itself into the different locations, into the different regions itself, in some scenarios like of disaster recovery. So if I'll say that we wanted to plan for a disaster recovery, and I want to say that in the terms of the disaster recovery, still I'll say that my users will be able to use my services, will be able to use my machines and the data over there. So in terms of that, we need to create the site recovery. So my data will going to be backed up. Same way, my services are also going to be replicated into a different location. So that is a major difference between the backup and the service site recovery. So the Azure backup will going to support the application consistent backups for both Windows and Linux machines. It will help you to keep your data safe and recoverable. The site recovery will protect your VMs from a major disaster scenario when a whole region will going to experience an outage. It will help to ensure the business continuity by keeping the business apps and workloads running during the outage scenario. It will also replicate the workload running on the physical and virtual machines from a primary site to a secondary location. Moving forward to that, if I'll talk about the Azure backup policy. So for creating the Azure backup policy, we can easily create it using the Azure portal, and also we can create it using some tools in the CLI method. So in the CLI, we just need to make down a kind of a command known as AZ backup policy create, and then we need to specify my management type. It should be my VM backup I'm creating, storage backup I'm creating, or workload backup we are creating. What is the name of the policy? What is the policy type I wanted to define? What is my resource group where I wanted to store the data? My vault name, my subscription, my workload type, and so on. So accordingly, you can create the policy from the CLI mode. Talking about while creating the policy on the public note, you can define your backup management type, name of the policy, JSON policy definition, name of the resource group, and recovery service word. So these options you need to just select. And after selecting these options, you can actually go for backing up your data on a very easy note. So Azure will going to retain the backup of your data for 14 additional days. That means if you are deleting your backup, still the backup is going to be available for next 14 days on your account. So you cannot delete the site, the specific, I'll say the recovery service vault for the next 14 days until the data is not going to be deleted permanently. So if by mistakenly your data is going to be deleted, whatever your backup data was, still you have 14 days to recover them. And over there, you can just click on the one single button to recover them, like undelete option. So from the data, select undelete option, and then your data will going to be recovered with a very easy note. So this is how the backup policy will going to be work. Whenever you wanted to perform and restore operations by using the Azure backup, so over there you need to verify the Azure settings and permissions. That means you need to select and check the permissions to create a recovery service vault. You need to ensure that you are having the proper rights for creating them. You need to select the specific subscription under which you wanted to create a recovery service vault. And every time you are creating the site recovery service vault, make sure that you will utilize the same subscriptions in it, because it's going to be a very easy to connect them. If you are selecting the multiple subscriptions, that is also going to be a possible way if you're having the multiple subscriptions in the single account. Then after, you need to prepare your VMs which you wanted to replicate under this specific area called site recovery service vault. So you need to ensure that you have the proper connectivity available, your machines are up and running, you have configured the root certificates over to that, you have installed the specific all the updates of the OS, you have installed the Azure backup monitoring agent, and also you have configured the rules in it, how the backup needs to be configured. Then you need to create a recovery service vault, and then you need to enable the VM replication here. So the VM replication will take approximately of 20 to 45 minutes for full site recovery, and for the backup, it's going to be take approximately kind of a combined timings depending upon the needs, like what kind of work do you want it to done, or how much of data do you want it to replicate. Accordingly, you can select the things here. Moving forward to that, if I'll talk about failover clustering to be created using the site recovery. So while working with the site recovery from the resource area, you need to come to the operations group. From the operations groups, you need to select this disaster recovery option. From the disaster recovery option, you need to select the target region. Where do you want it to create a disaster recovery? So just select the region, and accordingly in the image, it will going to show you the things in a dotted platform, that from this region, the data is going to be replicated towards this region here. And accordingly, you can go ahead and start replicating your data. But apart from the basics condition, if I'm going to the advanced settings, so in the advanced settings, it is going to ask you that, do you want it to create a new resources, same attached resources, what we are having with this VM in this region towards another region, or maybe you guys are already having the resources over there and you wanted to utilize those resources to be as a connected part. So you can select the things accordingly and you can define the things on your own. Once you have verified the settings, just click on this review and start replication, and your whole disaster recovery things will going to be replicated into a next region. So every time you will make a change here, within 2 minutes, the same change will going to be applicable to the next location also, whatever my another location we are having. Most probably the maximum time Microsoft is saying is of 5 minutes. So whatever the data you have uploaded just before 5 minutes, the same data is now presented towards another machines which is present in the another location over there. So that is something we were having in this fourth session, fourth domain of this course here, talking about the backup and the replication thing. If you guys are having any kind of questions accordingly, you can go and ask your questions here. Okay, so now let's move forward and talk about some questions from this domain here, talking about some fifth ones. So the very first question we are having in the list is, you need to search through the Azure monitor logs to find some records. Which query language would you use in terms of working with that kind of concept? Very first is SQL language. Second one is KQL language. Third one is FLogic, or the last one is LDAP. So let's get your answers on the chat and let me start the timer now. Okay, so the correct answer is option B. Whenever we wanted to work with the log analytics in the Azure, we will always utilize the custom query language, that is KQL language. The next question we are having in line is, you are responsible for creating a disaster recovery plan for your data center. You must be able to recreate the virtual machines from scratch. And this includes the operating system, its configurations, settings, and patches. Which of the following will provide a bare metal backup of virtual machines? Is it option A as your backup agent, option B enabling the disk snapshot, option C as your site recovery, or option D as your backup server? So let's get your answers on the chat and let me start the timer now. So the correct option is option D, Azure Backup Server. The site recovery will surely give me a replication of my machine and the services into a different region. But when it comes about the operating system configuration settings and the patches we have installed in here, so for that kind of scenario, we need to work with the Azure Backup Servers. That is another service we are having. So that is something we are having inside this specific course in here. Apart from this AZ-104, if you guys wanted to register for our upcoming webinars, relatively for other ones, you can visit our website, gtechlearn.com/webinar.aspx, and you can register yourself for free. Other than that, you can also scan this QR code here for registering yourself for the upcoming webinars. Moving forward to that, if I'll discuss some options that what kind of specific self-study material the Microsoft is providing to us in terms of working with this AZ-104 course. So if you guys will find the AZ-104 Microsoft Azure Administrator on Google directly, it will give you a website of learn.microsoft.com here. Just open that first link of learn.microsoft.com, and in this page, you will find each and every self-study material to be available. The very first is in here on online free option, you will find the respective modules types books. You can open this respective module books, and here each and every topics is going to be written in a clearly method, in a deep knowledge. You can visit and read out the things here. In each and every section, you will find some interactive lab simulation. That means how the specific option needs to be achieved a goal in the real-time scenario. Also, it will give you some sort of Q&A section in here to get yourself checked that how much prepared are we against this concept. And also you can get for each and every modules to be available. Same way, apart from this docs link, that is a self-study material, you can opt it from any view. Apart from it, in the tips section, it will going to give you some links. The very first link is AZ-104 exam prep videos that has been created by the Microsoft, and you can go and get the information from this exam prep video to be understandable. But this video needs to be there only that time once you have completed the self-study course. Then after, apart from this exam prep videos, it will also give you a study guide here. So using the study guide, you can actually go and check what is the specific topics, what is the skills that is going to be measured, and what kind of options we need to discuss or we need to learn before going towards the examination here. So each and every topics is actually defined in this book on a very detailed note. You can find the things. Other than that, they will also going to give you some free sample questions. So you can visit the free sample questions, and Azure is providing some questions here. You can read out the question. You can answer the questions accordingly. So just go ahead and start working with this scenario, and accordingly you can prepare yourself using the free materials. Now, moving forward to that, if I'll talk about the recordings of the current session, so how can you actually take the recordings? So for getting the recordings of the current session, you can visit to the gtechlearn.com/webinars.aspx. From the list of your webinars, you can come to this upcoming webinars, the upcoming schedules. You can open your specific webinars against which you wanted to get the recordings. And to this page, you will be able to get the recordings here. You will be able to find a specific option to view the recording right away, because the class is not over. So that's why the recording is not available. It may take 1 to 2 hours to upload the recordings here, but then after you will be able to watch them. You can also go ahead and see this link for the past webinar. If your webinar is not listed in the upcoming sessions, so you can go to this area on this past webinar section, and from that area you can find out all the past webinars which has been hosted by the GTech on a free note, and you can go for watching their videos on a free of cost from here using this watch now button. So that's how you can access the recordings. The next thing we were talking about, so GTech is also giving you some sort of self-paced course packages, which you can opt in here. Let me confirm that. So you can opt them using some free of cost. For first 15 days, the cost is going to be free. So we are having the 6 packages depending upon the ERP learning, Power Platform learning pack, Azure learning pack, CRM learning pack, security learning pack, data platform learning pack, and so on. So in each and every learning pack, if you guys are opting for it, so you will get the videos for the multiple courses on the same batch. Like in this CRM learning pack, you will get the video for 910, 210, 801, 1059, 55250, MB600, and so on. Same way for the other packages like security services, if I'll show you, where's my security learning pack. So relatively for that, you can get the videos for SC920, SC200, SC300, AZ-500, and so on. So accordingly, you can get all those videos to be enabled. And for first 15 days, it is totally going to be free. After that, you just need to pay a kind of a minimum amount of $19.99 for monthly basis, and you can subscribe yourself. So over there, you can get all the videos available. So this is something we are having from our side, and that is how things we are working. Now, let me just share you the guys a link from where you can download the specific PPT. So just give me a sec. I'm going to give you a link for that.